Hello everyone! In this video you will see a manhwa titled May the Holy One Come. Parts 1 through 4. Please put a like and subscribe if you like the video. After all, it really helps our channel. In the description below the video, there are time codes to quickly jump between parts. So let's get started. One day, the blessed land of Chiron declared a holy war. The black-eyed demons of Iphon and the witches of Tempe, who controlled the animals with sorcery, who surpassed humans in power, went on a rampage. Since it was becoming impossible to cope with the chaos that was taking place in the real world, a true saint was needed, who would be freed from the passage of time. Blessed by God himself, with an ageless body and unfading beauty. This is what the high priest of Chiron said, as well as the fact that only the believers of Chiron had received the sacred power of God. This was confirmed by the blue flame, the blue breath of God, which would judge the heretics of the earth. The high priest was pleased with the results that investigator Manhwa had been able to achieve against the demons of Iphon, but it was not enough for him. Despite the fact that the knight was popularly dubbed the strongest divine mace of Chiron, he was not yet able to get rid of the Tempe witches. Unlike the demons of Iphon, who relied on physical superiority and rushed into battle without a second thought, the witches were individually weak and fled the battlefield, hiding, using the terrain of Tempe. Finding absolutely every place they hid was quite difficult. But today, the high priest was ordering him to find one in particular. The great witch with eyes as red as blood. She was the leader of the witches, creatures who controlled beasts, and colored good souls with evil. A well-known strategy. It's worth chopping off the head and the torso will disappear on its own. But Manhwa had to be extremely careful, because it was said that the red eyes of the older witch bewitch with a single look, and the high priest did not want to lose such a reliable servant of God. The investigator frankly did not believe in this nonsense, but kept his opinion to himself. The search for Manhwa was not successful for a long time. The witches, who had never been trained, were quick to hide and run away, just like rats. Perhaps because of the great witch's power, but the fact remained. The cleansing party moved further southwest. The young witch doubted it was safe to stay in one place, provided the witches were being burned alive in the valley nearby. They could be found. The red-eyed girl especially did not react in any way to this sensible remark, and the girl was meanwhile being dragged outside. The other, older witches didn't like that she was questioning the words of Bieni the Great Witch. They were sure that she could not betray them because she was such a creature. The witch didn't have time to finish her sentence as she was overtaken by a knight's blade. Wherever the witches tried to run, there were soldiers everywhere. The Great Witch had left them to their doom. By Manhwa's order, all the girls had their eyes checked, looking for the red-eyed one. A girl was pushed to the knight's feet. The irises of her eyes were full of blood. The man immediately remembered the words of the high priest about the magical power of these eyes, capable of bewitching. A blue flame flickered between them. Manhwa had finally found the great red-eyed witch. The Great Witch was kept in the walls of the fortress of Rave, near Tempe on the state border of Chiron. There, the girl was blindfolded and tortured in a vain attempt to get some useful information out of her. This was because Manhwa saw something very strange in the ease with which they had caught the famed Great Witch. But the knights could not find anything special in the girl, despite their best efforts. From the temple, however, word came that the high priest's trusted man was to arrive at dawn and transport the captive to the capital. Manhwa, having heard the report, let his subordinate go, but he hesitated for a moment and told him something else. On the day they had caught the Great Witch, she had stood on a hill and laughed gleefully, looking at her burning tribesmen. Later, the red-eyed girl had tried to say something to Manhwa, but she hadn't been able to make any sense out of it. The knight could not understand what she was up to. The next day, early in the morning, there was a commotion among the inhabitants of the fortress. The high priest's confidant appeared at the gate. He was carrying a paper stating that the Great Witch was to be brought to the capital and executed. Dr. Pepin Toth, the high priest's authorized physician, was responsible for the transportation. His face was concealed by a white mask. The witch, meanwhile, was led out into the courtyard. There was no blindfold over her eyes because, as the servants explained, Poppin wanted to see the red eyes in person. The girl looked around and muttered something. The dogs suddenly snapped off their chains and fiercely attacked their own masters. The witch managed to snatch the chain from the escort's hands and run, but the road was blocked by Maya Clat. He dropped his hand to the hilt of his sword, drawing it from its sheath. Escape was a senseless and dangerous idea. However, the high priest's doctor, noticing the investigator's gesture, immediately warned that injuring the Great Witch was in no way allowed. The soldiers quickly oriented themselves and grabbed the girl by the scruff of her neck, pulling her back. She suddenly shouted that she would help Mayclad in destroying the witches, shocking everyone. Mayclad froze and frowned, puzzled, when the Great Witch suddenly offered to help destroy her own tribeswomen. The knight holding her by her shirt jerked the girl back again and dragged her towards the transportation cage. But suddenly, Mayclad ordered a halt and demanded proof from the witch. The people around them were dumbfounded by the question, but the man had little interest in their opinion. He looked at the girl. She told them to go to the Gavon forest, where she said was the home of the strongest witches. It was only a day's journey to the forest, and Maya Clath ordered that scouts be sent there, and the witch be thrown back into the dungeon until the truth of the tip was confirmed. At the council, along with the priests, an argument broke out. The clergy were adamantly opposed to trusting the Great Witch. They saw her words as a desperate attempt to save her own skin, and even if she did know something, the priests feared the consequences. Maklat listened to their outrage with enviable equanimity. A subordinate approached him and reported that the story told in the fortress was true. Maklat's patience ran out when the priest carelessly suggested that perhaps the investigator had already been affected by the magic of the red-eyed witch. Then the man lowered the witch's severed head wrapped in rags onto the table. The priest fell silent in surprise, but Maklath spoke. It took 3 years to completely destroy the demons of Ifon. The longer the war went on, the more damage was done to the troops in the hinterlands. Maklat was only willing to reverse his decision if the priest had some other idea on how to shorten the war. But if they just didn't like it, he suggested the church representatives go to the battlefield themselves in that case. Of course, Maklat wasn't going to let the witch stay alive forever, just as long as she would be useful. He asked Dr. Pepin to submit a request for a temporary pardon to the high priest to determine the red-eyed girl's usefulness. As conclusive results to the high priest, Mayaklat pledged to burn half of Tempe in 6 months. For 6 months, the Great Witch was kept blindfolded in the dungeon. When it was time to come out, a knight who came in roughly hauled her to her feet, grabbed her by the shoulder, and dragged her out into the hallway. He asked Mayklath where he should take the prisoner, but he decided to do it himself. In the study, the Great Witch was waiting for an interrogation from Maya Clay. He wondered if the witch had any idea why exactly she had been brought to this room. There were only half of the witches in the place she had named last time. Was the red-eyed girl so desperate that she had decided to say so? Or was this a ploy to help the witches? The Great Witch shook her head. If things were as the investigator had suggested, then why would Bieni say anything at all, much less the whereabouts of the other witches? At that, the captive was visibly nervous. A fine tremor was beating her. Maklate ordered the girl to take 5 steps forward. She could not disobey and hesitantly began to walk forward. The investigator stepped away from the table and ripped the blindfold off the witch's eyes. In 6 months, more than half of Tempe will be burned, Maklat was saying, and now a map of Tempe dotted with red crosses flashed behind his back. The Great Witch, not giving herself time to be frightened, walked over to the map and pointed her finger to the next spot. Suddenly, Mayclate called out her name. Bieni. That was the name the witches shouted out while they were being killed. The girl bit her lip. Just recently, before she had told her where the witches were hiding, this man had been indifferent to her plight. So why did he suddenly want to know the captive's name? Therefore, squeezing out her words forcefully, she said that Mr. Investigator didn't need to know the name. By doing so, she did not confirm that the name given was hers, but she did not deny it either. They returned to the case. The next location was the Valley of Glad. The witches were hiding near the cliff. If they were hiding in the forest, they would go there. Mayaklat questioned those words. It had been a long time since the Great Witch had left her tribe's women behind. If they were smart, would they stick to their old habits? Bieni only said that devil, worshipping people were fools. But Maklat did not relent. What if this time it would not be like in the Gawan forest? Then all the knowledge of the red-eyed girl would be useless. She herself would be useless. The witch jerked violently in an attempt to deny the man's words. She assured him that it was exactly as she said. In her excitement, Bieni didn't even notice that she had stepped on the chain, causing her to run into McClath. He remained unfazed and, barely catching the girl, roughly pushed her back against the wall. Where did the witch get such confidence in her words? Did she have a way of communicating with tribeswomen while in a prison cell? Maklat needed answers no matter how hard he hunted witches. As long as their leader lived, they would not be exterminated. The girl's heart raced in her chest. The faceless images of all the witches appeared before her eyes. They were calling her by name, pulling their vile hands and telling her that Bieni could never escape them. This brief vision made the girl hastily tell Maklat that if he heeded her words, he could destroy all the witches. And someday the sacred blue flames will also scorch Bieni's body until only ashes remain. But right now, she doesn't want to die. Mayaklat watched the captive's face carefully and nodded. He called a subordinate into the room and told him to take the witch to the room. The girl screamed, asked to wait, to answer where they were taking her. But eventually the captive was dragged by force through the corridors again, and pushed into the room. There, the high priest's doctor, who had finally removed his mask, was already waiting for the Great Witch. Bieni was pushed into the room with the doctor. She clearly hadn't expected to see this man here, but the man acted at ease, as if nothing unusual was going on. He had been treating the witch for 6 months now, but judging by her reaction, it was a very ambiguous treatment. And it was strange that he didn't just come to the girl's prison as usual. The doctor said that Mr. Investigator had reported the witch's injured leg, so he wanted to start the treatment first. Bieni was clearly not happy about this, but there was no choice. She obediently walked over and lifted the hem of her shirt, revealing the wound. The man examined the damaged area. Because of the blood and pus, the affected area was poorly visible and under the pretext of washing the wound. The doctor pushed the captive into a barrel of water. Then Pepin roughly pulled the girl's leg out and promised to heal the witch's wounds properly. It sounded ominous, with the words that pain was necessary in the name of healing. The doctor pressed a finger into the wound. Sparks sprang from Bieni's eyes and she screamed. The man paid no attention to these screams and continued talking about how, fearing the magic of the Great Witch, the guards in the prison periodically changed each other, and each time they were annoyed that they couldn't touch her. The doctor blamed the girl herself for this. He squeezed the witch's injured thigh extremely unkindly, running his palm upwards, all the way to the edge of her shirt. Bieni screamed again and kicked her tormentor in the shoulder with her foot. He stiffened and then laughed wildly. He was definitely bewitched by the witch's red eyes. Pim began to lean over her. The captive couldn't help but think that this was all punishment from Mayaklat for only half the witches in the place she'd told Stein about last time. Or she was going to be abandoned, thinking she was no longer useful. Diana urgently needed to get out, and she jerked toward the doctor's suitcase, eager to grab some of the tools from there. But the sadistic doctor had no time to do anything significant, nor did he notice the captive's impulse. Maklat kicked him, pulling him away from the girl. He ordered the high priest's confidant to scram. From now on, the treatment of the Great Witch was to take place in the presence of the interrogator every day at 11 in the morning. Pepintoth tried to object, but eventually closed his case of scalpels and withdrew from the room. The witch once again bit her lip painfully. She wondered if the investigator had seen her try to snatch the instrument. Still, the girl had rushed in, trying to find a way out of the situation. However, Mechlath was only concerned with the veracity of the rumors about the power of the red eyes. He suspected that they were the ones that had seduced Dr. Pepin, but Beanie denied the presence of any power in her red eyes, and the doctor had attacked her most likely because she was a powerless woman. But the investigator did not back down, clearly not understanding with words. Then the Great Witch rose to her feet and offered the man to check personally on himself the power of her eyes. If some evil force was at work after all, Mechlath would sense it. But the man only grinned, deciding that this time the witch was already targeting him. The girl thought bitterly that even after half a year of providing information, this man still didn't believe her one bit. Beanie decided to come at it from a different angle. During the last 6 months of this peculiar cooperation, the investigator himself had looked into the red eyes more than once, but he didn't seem to be bewitched. Or was the man afraid of pouncing on the girl's body at any moment after all? This bold statement enraged the investigator. His opinion was that even God would reject this girl's fallen body, and Pepin knew perfectly well that Mechlath would soon enter this room. But still, in spite of that, he lunged at the witch. So there was a good reason. And to establish it, the investigator decided to keep Beanie by his side. Now she will sleep in this room, and during the day to be near the investigator while he is busy working. So the man decided to do so to make sure that the prisoner is not hiding some evil force. It had been 6 months, but they had met less than 10 times, and at least now it was worth keeping the prisoner to himself and finding out for sure. Besides, the high priest would be visiting soon to see the great red-eyed witch. A few days later, already neatly dressed, but still wearing a blindfold, Beanie was led into the study. Mechlath was pensively studying the high priest's message. The news that he would visit Rave Fortress to see the great witch had spread quickly. Because of this, the doctor's absurd argument that the prisoner should be washed and cleaned up was accepted. Suddenly, the interrogator slammed the table, causing Beanie to flinch. He ordered her to stand normally. Then the man shifted his gaze to the handcuffs. They were sacred. If a person with magical powers touched a holy relic, they would be hurt. After his remark, Mechlath began to ask various questions. Is she the only red-eyed witch, and does she have proof if so? And whether she is definitely a witch at all. If she is definitely a witch at all, if she is so useless and can't even back up her words with something or use any powers? A great witch without powers is absurd. Beanie remained remarkably calm at the provocation. However, Mechlath was not impressed, and once again he continued to press her. He had his suspicions that the witch had somehow influenced the high priest's visit, even though she had spent the last 6 months in a dungeon. For example, she might have seduced Dr. Pepin and pulled some trick. To this, Beanie once again replied that she had no such power. The paper shattered as the investigator hit the table again. In a couple of steps, he was beside the girl, and holding up her hands, loomed menacingly over her. The man did not believe the witch, because if she was not lying, then what it... Mechlath spoke of the suspicious scars on the girl's body that resembled animal bite marks. They had appeared before the purification of Chiron had begun. Why would something like that be left on the Great Witch's body? Besides, in that forest, they found an interesting record that every season the witches sacrificed a woman. But it doesn't say why. Maybe the Great Witch sacrificed women to control wild beasts. Beanie's answer was simple, yet unconvincing. She claimed that witches made sacrifices for nothing. The investigator expectedly did not believe it, and only squeezed the captive's face harder with the palm of his hand. He continued to develop his idea that the witch, while saving her life from wild animals in the Tempe Mountains, had learned how to control them. That would explain the scars, and if the captive was unwilling to confess, Mechlath was quite willing to do some experimentation. The girl bit down on her bloody lips. The investigator released her face from his palm, backing away from the beast subjugation version. If the Great Witch really knew how to control them, she would not have submitted so easily from the start. The exhausted girl's eyes and lips were red, and it gave off an ominous impression, a match for the Great Witch. The investigator finally let go of the prisoner, and she slumped to the floor without any support. The man nonchalantly ordered water to wash his hands. No sooner had the servant gone to carry out the order, however, than he was rudely pushed away by the priest. He burst in on the investigator with accusations that the man had left the Great Witch at his side, though the priest was not supposed to know that. And the purpose of Maclate's actions, which was to determine the extent of the Great Witch's harmfulness, did not convince the priest. The priest insisted that such things should be investigated in a heavily guarded prison, but not in his private office. The old man's mind could not comprehend how irresponsible one had to be to let such a dangerous thing into his private space. His tirade was interrupted by a servant bringing water. Maclate stepped back to the cup, and the priest continued his exhortation. He insisted on handing the Great Witch over to the servants of the church, since Macleth was unable to appreciate the woman's real danger. The investigator was faintly affected by his words. The high priest had personally ordered him to watch over the prisoner. She could not be tortured or injured in any way, and he did not think the priest could have carried out those instructions. The priest claimed to be able to subdue the devil's power with a single prayer, but in reality that prayer was boiling water, an iron chair, nails, and an iron chair. Nails and an iron, these were their means of purification. And while the men were arguing, Biani became violently ill. The world began to lose its boundaries, to blur. The girl clearly understood what was happening, but she didn't want it. Not here and not now. So she tried to fight to keep her mind clear. Maclate, in the meantime, had put a stop to his conversation with the priest. He advised him to leave the powers of the gods to those who were allowed, and perhaps if they continued to pray diligently, God would give them holy powers, just like Maclath himself, who already has that power. The priest was clearly offended by such remarks, and in a fit of anger, he pushed the bowl of water in which the investigator was washing his hands. The spilled contents of the bowl splashed into Bieni's face. She covered her eyes and suddenly collapsed on her side. Maclate rushed to her, and the witch saw a rat in front of her. Bieni's life had been a mess. Looking back now, the girl realized that this was the case with both her own mother and her mother's mother. The girl found herself in a place that was unfamiliar to her. She wandered towards an underground passage, and the same rat followed her. Bieni needed to wake up, but how? It is unclear. Suddenly, the rat rushed forward. The witch rushed after her until she stumbled and fell down the cliff. Only then the Great Witch opened her eyes. In the room besides her were the investigator and the doctor who had examined Bieni's body while she was unconscious. Everything had been fine for a while, no injuries, but Maclath's keen eye had managed to detect blood on the bedclothes. It turned out that the girl's arm was now bleeding. As soon as he saw this, the investigator chased the doctor out the door, leaving him alone with his captive. He had guessed a great deal, and was now expressing his conclusions to her, watching her reactions carefully. If Bieni's own words were to be believed, the finger had been bitten by a rat in the cell, and now the crust of the wound had been accidentally peeled off. However, if that was the case, then the bite was already several days old, and it could not physically drain so much blood just because the crust had been peeled off. It turned out that what the witches did to the women meant not only sacrifices, animals were fed blood to control them. Bieni, however, was this very woman that the witches offered at every feast. The captive was amazed at how quickly this man had guessed everything, and she had managed to avoid being caught and arousing suspicion in the last 6 months. But now she had to tell everything honestly and in detail, because Maclath would not tolerate lies. This he had clearly demonstrated by blowing up the lamp with sacred power. Stammering, Bieni began to explain that the blood did not give control. It was a kind of one-sided obsession, obsession was an ability that made it possible to briefly utilize the sensations of a blood-fed animal. So Bieni didn't know how to control animals, and possession always only happened when she was asleep, so it's a rather unexpected and useless ability. By allowing herself to be bitten by more animals, the girl was trying to increase the chances because she couldn't know in advance at what moment and in which beast her consciousness would end up. However, such a power had nothing to do with seduction. Meklat doubted that, having the ability to borrow the vision of animals, Bieni had never used it. It was too tempting. Just then, the man changed the subject without much transition, informing him that there was no one in Glad's Valley, and if this tip in the past was not a ruse, the witch had better be told about the new place, and if any of the girl's words turned out to be false. Bieni looked at him fearfully with all her eyes. She felt especially keenly now that if she pushed the investigator away now, it would be the end, certain death on the scaffold in front of the raging crowd. The girl remembered the picture of her own mother strangling her, sincerely wishing for the death of her own daughter. It made everything inside shudder in animal terror. No matter how messy Bieni's life was, she didn't want to die. Not at all. Not at all. Not ever. Anything but death. When Bieni was just a child and entered the cave where the woman was being held, the woman suddenly rushed at her and began to strangle her. She mumbled the word die in a frantic manner. The only thing that saved the child was that the other witches pulled the mother aside. The girl herself was taken outside and the mother's terrifying cry of "You must die" was heard in her back. The witch who dragged Bieni outside forbade her to enter the cave without permission. Then the unfortunate girl realized that someday she too would be locked in there, and she would live a filthy, blood-smelling life. But even if Bieni's life was dirty, she wanted to accept death in the form she wanted. So she told the investigator the next location was Dyron Hill. A devil-worshipping family was located there. The girl could only hope that someone was still hiding there. Meklat watched the frankly worried witch closely. Without taking his eyes off her, he gave the guard orders to the sergeant to capture and dry all the rats living in the dungeon. A rich carriage belonging to the high priest was traveling along the road. In 10 days, he should have already arrived at Rave Fortress. The carriage was suddenly blocked by the villagers asking for his blessing on their knees. It was unclear how they knew, since the trip had been kept secret, but there was nothing to be done. The high priest was determined to go out to them, even if the delay would delay the journey to the fortress for another week. He could not turn his back on those who needed God, could he? Even though in public, the high priest appeared to be a very mild man with the brightest thoughts. Away from the eyes of others, he looked extremely unhappy with the whole situation. It had been a week since Meklat had gone on his campaign against the witches. Not to Dyron Hill, but to the Glad Valley, to the site of the last tip, off, which had turned out to be a hoax even for Bieni. But the investigator apparently decided to check again. Suddenly, Dr. Poppin entered the room. He had no right to be here, if only because Meklat had forbidden to enter this room until the end of the military campaign. But the doctor didn't care much about that, for this time he had the support of a taller man. Poppin freed the prisoner's legs from the shackles and announced that they were going for a walk. It was a long walk across a dry field. When they stopped, Bieni saw that the doctor had led her to the edge of a pit, half filled with corpses. Bieni didn't understand why the doctor had brought her to the edge of a pit filled with witches' corpses. Despite Pepin's suspicions, the girl did not think about running away, because it was useless in an empty field anyway. The girl was much more concerned about why there were so many corpses in the pit. Most likely, all the witches would be executed immediately after discovery. One informant is enough for them. There is no need for prisoners. And the girl did not even think about it. Suddenly, the doctor doused the confused Bieni with water with a mixture of medicines that attracted hungry beasts from all around. Around the perimeter, he stationed archers in case of an emergency. The doctor wanted to see how the beasts would react to the Great Witch's fresh blood, and now he'd finally been given permission to do it. He did not specify by whom. Bieni immediately remembered the conversation with Mayaklath. Had he really decided to do his experiment on her after all? The girl broke from her seat and ran. Of course, no animal in this world would do her any significant harm. The animals were just thirsty for the witch's blood, and once they tasted it, they would give up their aggression. She only ran away from them because the prisoner was frightened by the terrible fate of the Great Witch, and the fact that it was being repeated here. As soon as Maklath is convinced of the existence of the power through experimentation, she will try to kill Bieni immediately. In that case, the Great Witch will also be burned at the stake. The beasts finally caught up with the fugitive just as she stumbled and stretched out on the ground. The sharp fangs of the first wolf dug deep into her forearm, causing terrible pain. The second beast was about to attack as well. Bieni had time to think that this was how it would end. Even her death would be this messy. But the second wolf was scorched by blue divine flames. Standing up in defense of the captive was the suddenly appeared in the wasteland, Maklath. The investigator had questions for the doctor. He had definitely ordered the Great Witch to be locked up. So what was the significance of Poppin's antics? While the beast burned in blue flames, Maklath waited for the doctor to explain. Poppin had operated on the fact that to test the witch's unholy powers in advance was a direct order from the high priest, whose visit was somewhat delayed. The doctor even had a letter with the order which he had given to the investigator. Maklath ran his eyes over it. The high priest had gotten involved even faster than he'd thought, but that didn't matter now. The man tore up the letter and burned it, because the rave is his personal fortress and interrogation place for the heretics he rules. It absolutely does not matter who exactly Dr. Poppin was serving. Disobeying Maklath's orders in his own castle is unacceptable. This time, the investigator had simply torn up the letter as punishment, but he would not be so merciful next time. The doctor had only to agree to these terms. Maklath, on the other hand, roughly lifted Bieni to her feet. After all, they were not damaged, and she could walk safely. So the three of them turned to the fortress, while the wolf who had tasted Bieni's blood roared at them from the thicket. In the evening, the captive was dragged into a room that was unfamiliar to Bieni. There were some papers lying on the floor, which the girl even tried to pick up. At first, it seemed to Bieni that there was no one in the room, but Maklath quickly revealed his presence. He ordered the witch to come over to him, and the first thing he noticed was the blood seeping through the bandages. Most likely, the bite had bled again due to the chains sometimes being pulled too tight and putting pressure on the unhealed wounds. Maklath was surprised she was still alive at all, with this frequency of bleeding. The man then demanded an explanation of the appearance of the animal that drank the witch's blood. Bieni hastily explained. There is no need for them to catch the beast, because once they create a bond, it will die. It had always been like that. If it didn't happen, the girl would have already gone crazy because she shared sensations with many beasts. It would seem that why give up her body to be torn apart for such a short-term bond? But there were benefits to it. Bieni could thus anticipate the dangers that would befall the earth. Things like floods, earthquakes, and landslides. Things only beasts could know about. That's where things came into focus for Maklath. The priests had once pestered him about the extent of the Wicked Witch's powers, since they could avoid even natural disasters. Disasters, according to the clergy, were God's natural judgment, and witches avoided it time after time. I could see why. In any case, Bieni kept saying that there was nothing to worry about, and it would all be over in one night. Maklath, hearing this, decided to leave the prisoner in his private room. That is, in the room they were in now. Mayaklath left the Great Witch in her chambers to keep an eye on her and make sure of the obsession that unknown when and how it would arise during her sleep. He planned to keep the girl by his side for as long as it took for the next response. A full week had passed since then, and the witch had been awake the entire time. Was she trying to avoid being possessed? Either way, the interrogator rarely left her unattended, but that day he left his captive for a couple hours. A man showed up to question a witch caught in Glad's Gorge. The woman claimed that the Great Witch was the only one with true power and that all others were innocent. Only she is capable of responding, that is, experiencing possession, in order to predict the end of the world. The Great Witch is a sacrifice in the name of finding the beast that will trigger the end of the world. Since ancient times, witches have passed down a legend from mouth to mouth. Someday there will be a beast that will lead this world to destruction. And to prevent this, the witch, with the help of her power, must track it down. If the beast does not die after answering the Great Witch's call, it will mean that it is an incarnation of the devil intertwined with the witch. Once they found the one they were looking for, they would kill the Great Witch who had bound her soul to that beast. That was their plan to prevent the end of the world. It worked like this. The witches would feed the beasts little by little with Biani's blood, and as soon as a beast appeared that would survive after that, they were going to kill the girl at once. Maiklat did not believe this. He would much more readily believe that the witch had made up these ravings because of a lingering grudge against the Great Witch. The Great Witch has been captured, unable to find the beast, and will soon be consigned to the flames along with her tribeswomen. So there is no one to stop the end of the world? Maiklat pulled his hands away from the captive and ordered her to be dealt with, for he felt it would be no use. But suddenly, the woman reported the existence of another Great Witch. The Great Witch's essence was passed down by blood, but not too long ago, Biani's mother gave birth to another child. Biani doesn't know about it. The girl's mother herself lost her power long ago and lived only out of duty to leave behind descendants. Maiklat became even more somber and serious. Although Biani's mother is a witch, but she could not get pregnant miraculously by herself. There had to be a father. When the witch told about the father, the investigator was numb with surprise. That's how it turned out. The woman said it was impossible to know for sure who the Great Witch's father was. It's not easy to pass on the power of possession, so the Great Witch has to get the seed of different men until a suitable successor is born. Now Maiklat understood why Biani had given up on the tribeswomen so easily. Obviously, these women didn't deserve to have such a sacrifice made for them. It was better that the man didn't know that. He left the cell, ordering the witch to be dealt with. He could hear the screams of death in his back. As the investigator was about to leave the prison, he was approached by one of the soldiers. He, like the rest of his subordinates, was concerned about how long Mr. Maiklat would keep the Great Witch around. They could clean up Tempe now without the prisoner's denunciations. The priests are already whispering that the man is keeping the witch for personal purposes and thus tarnishing his good name. Is this woman so valuable that she was worth enduring these insults and nasty rumors for her sake? The soldiers wished that Maiklat would take advantage of the high priest's arrival and return to the capital. The investigator cut the soldier off mid-sentence. He attributed his actions to the need to confirm the Great Witch's powers to the end. If there were any problems after sending the prisoner back to the capital, the first to be targeted would be Maiklat himself. Finally, he advised the soldier not to let himself forget his duty because of unnecessary emotions and headed away, putting an end to the conversation. Maiklat rubbed his eyes tiredly. Glad's Gorge and Darren Hill. Both places indicated by the witch last time had actually turned out to be safe havens. Accordingly, the man had no basis for claiming that the witch had used a response to denounce her. The only beasts she could have encountered in the underground prison were rats. With a mere response, she is able to survey a limited area of the outside world. In that case, was she hiding another ability? If only the high priest hadn't reported her visit, then Maiklat wouldn't have paid so much attention to the Great Witch. He was reminded of his own words about not forgetting duty because of unnecessary emotions. It seemed that he himself could use some heed to them. When Maiklat returned to his room, he found Biani asleep. For the first time in a whole week, she had finally fallen asleep right on the floor, despite the discomfort. Suddenly, the girl jerked and wailed exhaustedly without opening her eyes. The response state differed from normal sleep only in that the bite site would begin to bleed. Remembering this, the man literally tore the bandages, under which the open wound was visible. Did it always happen like this? With each of those countless scars? with the screaming and the pain and the blood? Suddenly, a sweetish odor came from somewhere, reminiscent of grape wine. At the time of the response, Biani was being carried along with the wolf through the forest. The animal had come upon a lone man near a fire, and hunger compelled the beast to attack the hapless traveler. However, with a precise movement, the wolf plunged a dagger into the wolf's side. A group of men bent over the dying animal, all as one with inky eyes. That was the last thing Biani saw before she woke up already in Maycloth's room. But she was still in pain. It was as if she could actually feel herself dying from a punctured side on that forest edge. Biani was starting to get hysterical. The girl came to her senses only after Maycloth shook her by the shoulders and called her by name. He demanded to tell the contents of the dream, but it was difficult for the girl to speak, as her throat was dry. The investigator served water, but the Great Witch was unable to even hold the cup properly. The man showed unexpected mercy and removed the shackles from the captive, citing the irritation that the ringing of the chains supposedly caused. After a sip of water, Biani recounted the dream from beginning to end. Maclay didn't believe it because this wolf had been seen in the territory just outside the castle. Where did a group of men in a campground come from that killed a wolf? Also experienced hunters who could fend off an attack from a wild beast with a dagger. Maycloth was about to leave as Biani remembered the detail about the black eyes of those men. The investigator's hand on the doorknob trembled. What were the odds that the Great Witch, who had never left the lands of Tempe, knew of the monster? Men of Ifon. The man approached her again. He glanced down at the trail of blood on the cup. A sweet odor hit his nose with such force that for a moment, Maycloth wanted to taste it. The investigator picked up the cup. Biani hadn't lied about the connection to the beast infused with the Great Witch's blood. But what if that blood was drunk by a human? With clear intent, Maycloth began to reach for the blood trail with his lips. The witch protested and pulled the man's hand away. She couldn't let that happen, because a man who drank the Great Witch's blood would lose his mind and turn into a demon. The sweet smell of the witch's blood enveloped Maycloth, beckoning. The man hurriedly pulled away from the girl. No wonder the witch's blood was poison to humans. The investigator ordered Pepin to be brought in and was about to leave, but Biani stopped him with her questions. She thought that since the man had seen how the power worked, it should be brought back into the room. Maycloth was of a different opinion. He had just learned that the girl was a walking poison gland. Could he now send the captive away from him? Such a one should have been kept away from the rest of the humans. With desperate incomprehension, the witch thought that Maycloth, among others, should be kept away, but she couldn't say it aloud. Then she remembered the handcuffs, but the man had no intention of putting them on his captive, a kind of reward for obedience. But thinking about silly things just because she was uncuffed was still not allowed, and it was better to just enjoy the chance. Biani was very surprised. She remembered how other people had treated her. To put it mildly, not very kindly. And it turned out that Maycloth always looked at her as trash. Yet he was the one who treated the girl most humanly. The man left the room clearly in a bad mood because Dr. Papin, who came in, sensed his murderous aura. But even Biani didn't know what had caused such a violent reaction. It was reported to Maycloth that footprints had been discovered in the area behind the castle. Someone had set up camp and left in a hurry. Dogs were sent in pursuit. Maycloth decided to go and check it out personally. The soldier left, and the man was left alone with his thoughts. The witch's words that Maycloth had treated her most humanly stuck in his mind, followed by the high priest's stern voice ordering him not to allow himself to be questioned, to be cold-blooded. Never forget duty, for Maycloth is a servant of God. The man is overflowing with divine power, but its manifestation without intermediaries affects the mind. It can be extremely unstable, so control is needed. The control that in Maycloth was nurtured by the lashes of the high priest. The investigator dealt with the demons himself, and standing among the dead bodies, it occurred to him for the first time how nauseating the smell of blood was. The high priest arrived at the fortress. and the Great Witch was brought before him. The Great Witch was confused in front of such an important man. The priest standing next to her forcibly tilted her head, as if she were a doll, so that she would show respect to the high priest. But the priest said that there was no need to be so zealous, for the Lord is merciful to all who repent. The high priest reached out to touch the Great Witch, but Maklat intercepted his hand. There were whispers about the man's inappropriate behavior. Nor was the high priest himself pleased. He was going to take a good look at the prisoner and talk to her face to face. So the high priest ordered the room to be cleared and the table to be set. Maklat tried to impose his company, but his eagerness was not appreciated. The high priest knew how to be cruel and subjugate to his will. The scars on Maklat's back clearly demonstrated this. To argue with this man was not only useless, it was simply dangerous. Diana watched in amazement as the rigid and uncompromising investigator retreated before the will of the high priest. The atmosphere in the room where the meal was held was tense. From excitement, Bieni could not eat. The high priest handed her a glass of wine to relieve her cough. With trembling hands, she accepted it and drank the contents down. The girl felt dizzy. Now the high priest waited for her to answer his questions in good faith. He inquired about the healing of the bite from the wolf's mouth, though he assumed the witch was used to such a thing by now, for when she had first arrived at the fortress, she had had so many animal bites on her body. Bieni didn't know how honest one could be with the high priest. She understood that Dr. Pepin had written reports while examining the captive, but his research was one thing. But how much of the response information Maklat was revealing to the high priest in the reports was what really mattered. Worried, Bieni decided to discount the bites as signs of devil worship. However, such a response only disappointed the high priest. He was aware of the bloodline that bound the Great Witch to animals. And furthermore, he didn't care who gave the girl this power, the devil or someone else. In Bieni's mind, at one glance at the high priest, the words that since ancient times, luxurious things were considered to be impregnated with poison surfaced, and the devil tempts man with beauty. The high priest made the Great Witch an unexpected offer. She should kneel before him and serve her power to him personally. Then all torments would end. The man even promised to stop the witch hunt in such a case. Bieni only had to agree and use her power at the high priest's command. Who would have thought that this terrible and frightening proposal, which even the Great Witch didn't want to think about, would be made not by someone else, but by the high priest himself? Indeed, the situation was worse than ever. After his conversation with the Great Witch, Maklat burst in on the high priest, despite the efforts of all the church officials to stop him. The hard-headed investigator needed to know exactly what the high priest and the witch had been talking about. The man noted Maklat's shrewdness. The high priest found the Great Witch not only sweet and beautiful, but also very useful. In his opinion, that was why the investigator himself was not going to hand over the Great Witch. Maklat insisted that they still needed to denounce the asylums. There was nothing in his actions but a desire to keep the high priest safe from a creature that needed to be extremely careful with. So he said. The high priest hummed. He concluded that Maklat had been bewitched. Those words shocked the investigator. The man was confident in his open-mindedness toward the captive. What he did not understand was the high priest's strange interest in the devil's power. A very curious answer awaited him. The high priest did not regard God as an absolute virtue. How could God be exceptionally merciful if the devil was also a son of God? Maklat decided to tell about another descendant of the Great Witch. If the high priest needed that power so badly, he had, of course, intended to keep this information secret until he could verify the veracity, but the situation was compelling. Now the investigator would have to immediately send men out on a search to deliver the child to the high priest. The head of the clergy was satisfied with this state of affairs, and the next time they should talk would be after the descendant had been found. Maklat bowed and strode away. The high priest turned away and remarked casually, given the interest in the same thing, "You can't fool the blood." Maklat, not in the best of spirits, entered the private room. Bieni was sitting by the fireplace, though she could have taken a seat on the sofa. This slightly annoyed the man, but he restrained himself from remarking. Besides, Bieni had suddenly spoken first. She sincerely hoped that Maglet would not end the witch hunt and exterminate all of them in Tempe, without a trace. He had to wipe out absolutely every descendant of the Great Witch, down to the last one. This worried her so much that she bit her lips again and gnawed her fingers in anxiety. The investigator heard the tantalizing scent of blood again. The man lambasted Bieni, ordering her not to mix dirty personal interests with God's calling. But the irony was that from the beginning, personal interests had been the reason for the girl's denunciations. Bieni feared that now even they were no longer needed by the Inquisition. Maglet denied the needlessness of denunciations, although in this he was frankly sly. The investigator was not going to let the witch off the hook. Whatever words the high priest had spoken to her, it was not worth getting her hopes up. He ordered her to stretch out her leg to put on the shackles. Shackles without handcuffs. Bieni considered a good sign. In her eyes, Maglet was a gentleman of unshakable piety, but suddenly she was plopped down on the unconscious man's chest. Bieni slumped unconsciously against the man's chest, and he smelled the odor of alcohol. It was worth a guess, for the high priest always suppresses his opponent in this way. Maglet shifted the girl's body onto the sofa and gritted his teeth in impotent anger at himself. He had spent only a couple of days languishing, and now he was drooling at the sight of red, just like a trained animal. Could it be that Pepin had smelled that sweet-smelling odor too, and that was why he'd been awakened to unbridled lust? Better to be able to deal with it as soon as possible. The next day, Bieni was to name the place again. She looked suspiciously long at the map dotted with crosses, as if she had no one to denounce. However, the problem was different. All the remaining shelters were located a considerable distance away from the Rave Fortress. The greater the distance, the longer Maglet would be gone. During that time, the high priest could try to do something to the Great Witch. Nevertheless, there were no alternatives in store, and the girl pointed to the next place, the Ain Gorge. Dr. Pepin then entered the room, having come with a message from the high priest. The head of the clergy hoped that the investigator would fulfill the arrangement as soon as possible. Maglet's cheeks flared with anger. The arrangement obviously meant searching for another descendant of the Great Witch that Bieni knew nothing about. Therefore, the girl did not understand why the man was angry. Maglet had wheedled out an order to tell the high priest that he would depart within 3 days. But the unpleasant surprises from Doctor did not end there. He asked to take a walk with the Great Witch outside, as she was clearly lacking sunlight indoors. And the high priest is worried about the prisoner. In short, as soon as the high priest arrived, Pepin immediately fluffed his feathers. But the investigator had no specific reason not to let the Great Witch go for a walk with the doctor. He let them go, but on the condition that he would have a soldier accompany them. Bieni rejoiced at the possibility of not being alone with the doctor. She rejoiced early. Pepin, as soon as they were out, tried to lead her away from the fortress. The soldier tried to stop the man, for Mr. Maglet had forbidden to leave the walls of the fortress, but the gate opened. The doctor, pulling the girl by the chain, rushed to the exit, and the soldier could not keep up with them. Pepin led the Great Witch to the part of the fortress where the corpses of the executed hung. Among them was the woman who had been constantly near Bieni's mother. The doctor warned that if she did not interest the high priest, she would eventually end up just like all those corpses. He strongly advised not to rack one's brains and meekly bow down, an unenviable choice anyway. But why was the witch hung on the wall when they were usually executed immediately by burning in the blue flames? Not taken to the fortress. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. It wasn't long before a witch was arrested alive for the first time in a long time. And Pepin was going to tell the girl something interesting. Maglet had been told that the doctor and the Great Witch had gone outside the fortress. Worse versions of what they were doing came to mind. For example, Bieni might have been sharing blood with the beasts again, or with Dr. Pepin in general. The girl answered honestly. She had seen corpses hanging from the castle wall, In particular, the witch that the investigator had recently arrested and then strung up. Poppin had said she had begged for her life, promising to take the place of the informer instead of the Great Witch. And Bianna was truly grateful that Maclay had chosen her over that witch. The girl had not been told what the woman wanted to report, but if it wasn't Bianna hanging on the fortress wall now, then the information wasn't that valuable. Somehow, it was hard for Maclay to look at the captive and hear her say that. On impulse, the man ripped the collar off and ran his fingertips over the bruise on her neck, puzzled. The surprising trepidation of the touch made Bianni cry out. It was not only her neck, however, but her shoulder as well, for the doctor had been dragging the girl around all day, using the walk as an excuse. Needless to say, there were marks left from his rough grip. The witch had treated it with humility, but here was Mecloth's stare at the bruise. The man also pressed carelessly on her shoulder. From surprise and pain, Bianni reflexively pushed the investigator away from herself, for which she immediately apologized. He stared at her intently for a while, and then ordered dinner to be served. Only Bianni was seated at the table. She was used to seeing everything in a negative light and found only one explanation for such an act. That Mecloth wanted to fatten her up so that she would burn longer at the burning ceremony. All this time, the man kept a furtive eye on the witch. 3 days later, on the day of departure, Mayaklatt took the Great Witch out into the courtyard of Rave Fortress and told her to enter the cage. He was going to take Bianni with him on this trip. He and the High Priest had an unpleasant dialogue about it. He didn't understand the investigator's logic. Why would he want the Great Witch on his quest? Maclay said that it was for the fulfillment of the deed he had mentioned. The High Priest called him a poor woman who had taken God's test. They drove for quite a long time. The witch's eyes were spinning. She felt sick. She could hear the desperate and tearing cries of the witches who couldn't understand why Bianni had betrayed them. The wails of the dying land filled her ears. She was the cause of the decline of this land, so she didn't want to come here. But as always, no one gave her a choice. Soon the girl was led into the tent to Mayaklatt. Bianni cast a glance at the map. It seemed strange to her that the final destination was the Teak Plain. After all, she had only indicated the Aini Gorge. Maclay assumed that the Great Witch's denunciations relied on the power of sorcery, and he wanted Bianni to find someone for him. He didn't believe the girl's words, that she was merely naming the refugees she remembered, because Ain Gorge had become a witch's hideout no more than 2 months ago, when the Great Witch was no longer with them. Chiron didn't depend only on Bianni's denunciations, so now it no longer mattered what kind of witchcraft she used. The girl was still waiting for death, but if she found the investigator the one he wanted, then the conversation would be different. It was then that Maclay revealed to Bianni that the mother who had borne her had given birth to another Great Witch. The girl's legs gave a shake at this news. Even as a child, the other witches had told her that her mother could no longer give birth and had therefore exhausted the value of her existence. The birth of a new Great Witch signifies the decline of the power of the witch before her. Bianni's birth marked the end for her mother, and it made the woman want to kill her daughter so fiercely, for if she hadn't, in the end, Bianni would be replaced too, and so it would go on forever. This is the hated fate of the Great Witch. Could the girl free herself from her? Bianni clutched her head. There was only one thought swirling in her mind. The new Great Witch must be found and killed. Otherwise, the girl's desperate efforts would be nothing more than useless floundering. Mecloth understood the captive's reaction in his own way and considered such a violent emotion as doubt, but she had begged him to purge the world of the Great Witches down to the last descendant. The moment the man bent over her, Bianni's mind suddenly became clear. The blue flame of Chiron, a man capable of turning all of the devil's minions to a handful of ashes, a servant of the Lord who would consign any evil to the flames in the blink of an eye. The Great Witch had sold her tribeswomen and herself to him to escape, so it was worth trusting this man, for he could put an end to the vicious cycle. he would be able to save Bieni from the terrible fate of the Great Witch. An expression reappeared on the girl's face, as if she had already renounced everything, but still desperately wished and believed as if Megclat would realize her dream. She promised to be sure to find him another descendant if he would commit him to the fire. She looked remarkably determined, even enthusiastic. Bieni kept thinking about Megclat's words about the new Great Witch. If he wasn't lying, there wasn't much time left before the power would leave the girl. It was urgent to find the mother and child and kill them. The horror of the sight from her distant childhood was surprisingly fresh. She remembered how her mother had been pleasured by many men to give birth to more offspring, and the woman blamed her daughter for her loss of power and never gave up trying to strangle the child. Even if another child of the mother survived, it would suffer the terrible fate of the Great Witch, just like Bieni herself. Since that was the case, it was better to get rid of her with her own hands. It would even be merciful. In the cage, Bieni often hit the steel bars and earned more and more bruises. After all, the coachmen didn't try to carry the prisoner carefully. Suddenly, the procession came to a halt. Megclat was summoning the Great Witch to him. They were soon to arrive at Ain Gorge. Megclat wondered if Bieni could confirm with her power where the new offspring's mother was. Bieni could, but it would take 3 days. An unacceptable luxury. She could do it in a quarter of a day, but she had to be alone. Of course, she didn't believe that Megclat would do it, but suddenly the man agreed. That said, Bieni would be on a closed cliff where she could be easily tracked. He told her to proceed as soon as she was ready. The witch looked after the one who hated the unclean power the most, almost admiringly. Megclat and the high priest's men were waiting for Bieni. However, her allotted time was already up. Dr. Pepin was worried that the Great Witch might have escaped in a quarter of a day. It was too much for them, even if it was to search for the captive's mother. The man was frankly tired of listening to their lamentations, so he went to check on Bieni himself. Admittedly, he too doubted whether she would make a desperate escape attempt. Even if it's the top of a cliff, who knows what a witch trapped in a dead end is capable of? But the look on her face as she vowed to exterminate all witches seemed sincere. Maybe that's why Megclat subconsciously believed she wouldn't run away or kill herself. That's when he finally saw Bieni. She had found her mother. She was on the teak plain, but the man almost didn't hear the words. He thought he had gone mad because this red-eyed great witch suddenly appeared to him as a deity. She seemed so holy that for a moment Megclat wished he could be trampled by her. How disgusting and immoral is that? Blue fire scorched the witches, burning the heretics alive. Desperate screams, moans, and pleas for help could be heard. Bieni bit her lip as she watched the process of the hunt. Dr. Pepin, who had brought the captive to this hill, seemed to mock her, asking about the sensations of the sight. He wondered whether the fiery inferno, to which she had contributed a great deal, touched the girl at all. His gaze fell on her bitten lower lip. He grabbed the witch's chin, looking closely at the blood. Under the pretext that Mr. Megclat had been overreacting to Bieni's wounds lately, Pepin began to wipe away the blood with a handkerchief. Bringing his face closer, he silently regretted that he hadn't had as much fun with her in the underground prison while he had the chance. And now the witch's wounds were so hard to see. The doctor thought that it was also difficult for the prisoner to get used to this sudden peace. And that's why she kept biting her lips, because it's calmer when there's at least one wound of some kind. Bieni suddenly repulsed Pepin's hand with her handkerchief. The man, infuriated by the impertinent prank, grabbed her by the hair and reminded her of the position she was in. A captive who should obediently crawl to her feet when addressed with a smile and think hard about who now actually held the thread of her life. The doctor straightened his hand, tugging at her hair. The girl hovered over the cliff, just a little more, and she would have fallen down to where the blue fire blazed. It was worth it for the man to unclench his fingers. Suddenly, however, the blue fire appeared very near, and Pepin recoiled from the witch. Below, Megclat was looking down at them with a frown. The doctor, realizing the foulness of the situation, hurried to lead Bieni away, back to the cage. There, the witch thought long and hard about what had happened. It was unlikely that Ma Clay could see from this distance that it was her. But then again, the man had used the sacred fire to protect her last time. Bieni's thoughts were interrupted by the investigator who appeared for her personally. He led the witch behind him into the tent. The girl was lost in speculation as to why the man had returned so early. Suddenly, Maklat said that Dr. Poppin would return to the castle before them. The man felt that Bieni was too dependent on the man, and things looked like they had a very close relationship. Close enough that the doctor was kindly wiping the blood from the great witch's lips with his handkerchief. Once again, Bieni insisted that she had not seduced the doctor, and he had not drunk the great witch's blood at all. Anyone who drank Bieni's blood would turn into a demon. It was impossible not to notice. Meklet needed either proof or an excuse to try this poison. Completely unexpectedly for the girl, the investigator took her face in the palms of his hands and kissed her, licking the protruding red drops from her lips. Bieni pushed him away from her and looked at him with a completely uncomprehending gaze. Bieni tried to realize why Maklat had kissed her. It was too sensual for a meaningless kiss, meant only to determine the truth of the witch's words. The investigator, as usual, left without explaining anything. He clearly didn't care about the prospect of being turned demon because of the girl's blood, and for the next week, Bieni was tormented by doubts and thoughts. Meklat, fortunately, did not turn demon, but did not come to her. All he did was hunt witches relentlessly. Perhaps it was a matter of divine power. Bieni couldn't understand why such a man would kiss her. He couldn't just like her. The wagon braked sharply, adding a couple extra bruises to the witch. The soldier who came kicked the prisoner out of the cage and onto the grass. The road ahead was blocked, and the escort decided to leave the wagons behind. The witch's hands were shackled again. The soldiers didn't treat Bieni with any particular ceremony, allowing themselves to push her, ordering her to move and dragging her by the chain. Such attitude of people was usual for the girl, but Maklat's care wiped out the memories of it. To be more precise, she perceived all the man's actions as care, despite all his outward coldness. The journey was hard for Bieni. The bumpy roads wiped out her feet. She stumbled almost on a flat spot and barely had time to get up before the dog that had been walking behind her got its sharp fangs right into the girl's ankle. Now the night would bleed because of the bond she had with the dog. Bieni thought of Maklat again. If he were around now, it would be easier. In this whole situation, the only thing that made her happy was that the soldiers had stopped for a rest. They allowed the prisoner to go wash up. Bieni's wound ached, and her whole body ached with fatigue. Tomorrow was to be spent all day in this condition. She would like to know what Maklat was doing now. She tried again to chase the man out of her thoughts. In her reverie, the witch tripped and fell into the water. The blood from the wound continued to pool red around her feet. A lump was coming up to her throat. Everything was coming to one thing. Whether Bieni would drown in the water here, burn alive in the blue flames, or throw herself off the cliff didn't matter. She just wanted to be free of the bloody blood at last. Tears came to her eyes from despair and exhaustion. Maklat's voice sounded behind her. Bieni turned around sharply and met the investigator's gaze. Maklat waited for her to answer. Why was the prisoner suddenly in the woods alone? Without an overseer, the investigator ordered her to get out of the water. Bieni got up, but her injured leg made itself felt, and she staggered. The man wanted to be indignant, but the girl apologized with such a pathetic look that he decided not to continue. Instead, Maklat threw his cloak over her frail shoulders and lifted the captive in his arms as lightly as if they weighed nothing. And thus, they made their way to the tent. This care made Bieni cry again. The girl awoke already in the tent with her leg bandaged and warm. Maklat sat behind her. The captive was sincerely glad that the man did not turn demon, which she informed him with all the directness inherent in a girl. The investigator shook his head and brought her food. After the meal, he ordered her out of the tent with her cloak on. Bieni found herself once again in a state of confusion. She had only felt contempt from this man before. but he had kissed her unexpectedly, then started to hold himself aloof again. Now the man was again acting as if he was concerned about the witch. She didn't understand anything anymore. When Bieni went outside, Mayaklat was waiting beside the horse. The captive immediately thought that now she would be forced to follow the animal, but Mayaklat easily lifted the girl into the saddle and climbed in after her. As always, he was supposedly guided by concern for the common good. Specifically now, the man made such a decision because Bieni would be slowed down by an entire army. Touching the reins, Mayaklat let the horse gallop. The very next day in the afternoon, the army was due to arrive on the Teak Plain. The soldier reporting to Mayaklat feared that the witches would not be there, and it was merely a ploy by the Great Witch to lure them into a trap. A plain, after all, is not a good place to hide. Then again, maybe that's what the witches are counting on. The plain is a bad place to hide, so the troops won't check it out for lack of sense. Mayaklat let the soldier go. He himself began to wipe his body of sweat, having had no opportunity to wash himself during the campaign. The man's gaze was drawn to the wound on Bieni's ankle. How had she walked all day in such a state? Truly weak, pesky, dangerous, and not sleeping at all. The witch, quite unexpectedly, offered her help to wipe her back as well, which Mayaklat's hands could not physically reach. Mayaklat was stunned by this suggestion from Bieni. The way she looked and spoke confirmed that the Great Witch was completely unable to understand her situation. Otherwise, she wouldn't have behaved so defenselessly. Her status as a Great Witch did not awaken any pride or sense of responsibility in her. Gritting his teeth, Mayaklat gave in to his desires and accepted Bieni's offer. The girl rubbed her skin not too quickly, which frankly unnerved him, and at the end, noticing a blade of grass, tried to brush it off and touched her fingers to the exposed skin. Mayaklat flinched and jerked the witch's hand away in surprise. Growling with anger, the man toppled Bieni over and loomed over her, narrowing his eyes dangerously. He saw the girl's actions as an attempt to use him as well as Papin. But the girl's conscience was indeed clear. She had never used either the doctor or Mayaklat by means of seduction. And what she herself found interesting was why the man showed her mercy time after time, like the high priest. Was it out of a desire to win her over to his side, or was it something else? Mayaklat found the suggestion absurd. His mercy from the outside looked more like an attempt to put the captive to bed. But Bieni was sure that was not the case, for the man had not turned demon. By demon, she just meant those men who go mad with lust for the Great Witch. So the reason for Mayaklat's illogical urges was the blood he drank. If just a few drops did something like that to him, how strong was that power? The world definitely needed to be cleansed of all the devil followers who contradicted God's will, leaving not a single one behind. Bieni sincerely believed that Mayaklat had not been converted by a demon because their behavior was completely different. They wouldn't have come to confusion in his place and would have taken any chance to immediately pounce. Only now did the man fully realize that he shouldn't have drank her blood in the first place. He should have known better. Having only tried it once, one would want a second time. The cold and mocking voice of the high priest sounded in his head. Wow, Mayaklat. Fallen under the spell of the Great Witch? It gave him a wicked determination. Mayaklat gave in forward, kissing Bieni. There was no way such a strong attraction could not have arisen from the Great Witch's blood. And even if it was God's test, may Mayaklat fail forever. Here and now, he didn't care. Bieni saw the demons getting close to her mother. After drinking the woman's blood, they lost their minds. All they wanted was the body of the Great Witch. Little Bieni was scared to hear the sounds from the cave at that moment, especially when one of the demons reached for her herself. The witches pulled the man away then, because the girl couldn't carry the child at that moment, but the man didn't even recognize the child in front of him. Such is the Great Witch's mission of procreation. Nasty and frightening. Right now, Bieni was confused by the sensations. It was strange that actions that once seemed repugnant were now bringing the girl pleasure, and that her partner was Mayaklat. But if he wasn't fascinated by blood and not trying to lure the witch to his side, then why was the man doing this to her? Mayaklat's own body was engulfed in flames, as if a divine power was trying to cleanse him of his filth. But even so, he didn't want to stop, even if he burned to a crisp and turned to a crisp and turned to ash. No longer would Maklet be able to return to a time when he didn't know this woman and her embrace. In the morning, when Bieni awoke from her nap, she asked Maklat to cleanse the world of evil. Then he could free himself from it. She wanted the man to use his god, given power to consign the filth to the fire. She wanted him to be steadfast and know no mercy, just as he had been before. The witch counted herself among the foulness too. It seemed to Bieni that it would not be difficult for Maklat to kill her. The man replied that the flames would envelop the Tempe territory regardless of what Bieni or himself thought. It was obviously the answer the girl had been waiting for. But, for some reason, her chest gave an agonizing squeeze. The next day, Bieni discovered a considerable gash in her clothes. Maklet came in and told her to put on the black shirt he had brought. The girl obediently dressed and asked permission to accompany the investigator on the witch hunt, and it wasn't about the soldiers who could do anything. She thought that today, by finding the mother and child, Maklet would cleanse the world of all the great witches.
Bieni's eyes looking at Maklet read hope that the man would keep his promise and purge the world of the great witches today when he found the child. This left the Inquisitor at a loss. He pressed his lips into a thin line and turned away, throwing from behind his shoulder that it went without saying, and ordered him to stay in the tent. Bieni stopped him with a request to return the shackles. Maklet glanced at the girl's still unhealed ankles, not understanding why such a request was made, since her feet had not yet healed. However, Bieni was somehow not confused by this, and she thanked him in advance for honoring her request. The Inquisitor tasked his tongue in displeasure and moved sharply closer, leaning in to kiss the lips of the witch who had not expected such a thing. He shared his observations about the girl. When she seemed to be subdued, she would immediately become insolent, and when she seemed to be smart, she would immediately find ridiculous reasons to hurt herself. After these words, Maklet again ordered him to wait for him in the tent and headed away. Bieni did not look at his back, but faded her gaze. A painful thought crossed her mind. Nothing would change, for today Teak would be drowned in flames, and the line of the great witches would finally be broken. The hunt was in full swing. There were screams and death groans of the captured witches. In the midst of this chaos, an exhausted woman with eyes burning with scarlet light stood in front of the soldiers with a child in her arms. Angry tears of despair rolled down her face, and she loudly blamed everything on her child, after whose birth the great witch had lost her powers. And she regretted that she had never been able to kill the child to get her powers back. The dog on the soldier's leash was barking. There was a delicious smell coming from the woman with red eyes, and the animal wanted to eat it madly. But the leash was tightened time after time, preventing it from advancing. The animal also saw a subordinate of Maklet approaching. He ordered the mother to be killed, but the child to be left alive and taken with him. The sentence was immediately carried out, to the angry, tearful barking of a dog that regarded the red-eyed woman as its prey. Bieni opened her eyes abruptly. The bandages around her ankle and the sheet were soaked in blood from the open wound. The great witch had gotten a response from the dog that had bitten her last time, so the events she saw were in real time. The witch hunt was apparently in full swing. Bieni was confused by Maklet's action. Why did he take the child with him? On the other hand, a much more important question was why the child in the arms of the mother was not a great witch? The girl realized this from the fact that the dog smelled the scent of just one great witch, Bieni's mother. It was Maklet who said that another descendant of the great witch had been born, and he couldn't know for sure if the child was fake or not. Then why hadn't the Inquisitor killed the child after all, assuming it was another great witch? When realization came to Bieni, she bent in disbelief. Maklet has none of the abilities that distinguish a great witch. Surely now the man must be thinking that this child is the next witch, yet even so, he did not consign it to the fire, but took it alive. The words of the high priest came to mind, that they would not kill Bieni and her tribesmen if she swore to serve. From the beginning, this hunt had been arranged for the high priest. Maklet had come here to present this man with a child, as he wished. But if it was suddenly revealed that the child was not the great witch at all, then the high priest would clearly become enraged. With these thoughts, Bieni went to the guards guarding the tent and asked for permission to wash before the Inquisitor returned. She chose the open wound as a pretext, because of which she would not be able to escape. To convince her, she pointed out to the soldiers that Maklet had not put her in irons. The soldiers hesitated, but finally let her go, and Bieni headed away from the camp. She sincerely hoped that Maeklat would fulfill her wish, hoped that he would understand the terrible fate of the Great Witch. But now the girl was overwhelmed only by acute regret. The Inquisitor, like all the others, wanted only her blood. Standing by the water, Bieni realized that Maeklat would not keep his promise. The hunt was coming to an end. The soldiers had scoured every inch of the plain. A frightened child sobbed in one of the men's arms as he tried unsuccessfully to soothe it. Maeklat looked at the child, frowning his eyebrows. That woman with the scarlet eyes had so easily claimed that she wanted to kill her own blood. But thanks to that, the Inquisitor had gotten some useful information. If you kill the new Great Witch, the power will return to the past witch. In other words, only one person can wield the power of the Great Witch. And if that child is awakened, then Bieni loses its value. In that case, the High Priest will no longer be interested in her. The Inquisitor was distracted from his sad thoughts by a soldier who reported that almost all the witches had been destroyed, except for a couple of people who had hidden themselves. He offered to let the dogs off their leashes to search for them, but when Maeklat lowered his gaze to the dog, he abruptly grabbed it by the collar, staring at its muzzle in disbelief. The dog's eyes were burning scarlet, which spoke of the Great Witch's use of power. The Inquisitor abruptly turned around and headed for the horse. Jumping into the saddle, he let the animal gallop, hurrying to the camp. There, he approached the carefree, chattering soldiers who were guarding the tent with Bieni inside. When they saw the rapidly approaching chief, they fell silent in confusion. Maeklat pulled back the canopy with a jerk and saw only an empty tent with traces of bloody footprints. When asked about the whereabouts of the Great Witch, the soldier mumbled that she had gone to wash herself, because she had hurt herself on the stove. The Inquisitor narrowed his eyes dangerously. So much blood couldn't have come from some scratch. Obviously, Bieni experienced a response. The Inquisitor gritted his teeth and turned on the heels of his boots, walking away from the tent in wide strides. He'd been played for a fool. She didn't take off her shackles even when she was alone, and not only that, she refused to take them off even when the man offered. But why did Bieni run away? Was all her facilitation just an act? But she was so desperate to exterminate all witches, wasn't she? Maeklat covered his face with his palm and ordered himself to calm down. Judging by the way the blood had dried, Bieni had left about an hour ago. She physically couldn't have gotten very far with those wounds on her legs. Besides, there was a cliff in that direction. The man held out hope that he could catch up with her. He planned to ask questions after he had captured the fugitive, and once Maeklat caught Bieni, he would never let her go again. The Inquisitor's thoughts were abruptly interrupted by Bieni's voice. Standing on the edge of the cliff, she asked if the hunt was over. Maeklat froze, staring at her with wide-open eyes. Suddenly, a wall of rain poured down. It brought the man out of his daze, and he wanted to ask why the girl had run away, but he was interrupted by Bieni. She reminded him that Maeklat had promised to purify Tempe with fire, but the High Priest had offered to stop the witch hunt if she would obey him. Maeklat froze in astonishment. He was unaware of this offer from the High Priest. After a little thought, the Inquisitor revealed that since Bieni would soon lose her powers, the High Priest would lose interest in her. Bieni bowed her head, grinning unhappily. Maeklat was going to sacrifice this child, newly born, because only a descendant of the Great Witch was of great value to them. And since that was the case, Bieni thought herself a fool for naively hoping for a modicum of sympathy from Maeklat, since he was the only one who had seen her thrashing around up close. But he had not the slightest desire to use Bieni, and the only reason the man had saved her was just a bed. The girl knew a witch who was capable of warming the Inquisitor's bed, and she herself wanted one thing: to be consigned to the fire now. After all, she would lose her usefulness by losing the power of the Great Witch. Bieni didn't want to be humiliated, so she thought it was better to die right away. Maeklat, feeling the bitterness spilling over his tongue, averted his eyes. The man justified his reluctance to consign Bieni to the flames by saying that he could not use the divine power for his own interests. Bieni hummed thoughtfully and set her foot back, about to take a step backward, a step that would topple her off the cliff. Maeklat reached out to her fearfully, realizing that she would crash to her death. But Bieni only told her dream of dying in the water with a smile, and she went down. Maeklat shrieked and rushed toward her, trying to grab her, but there was only air in the palm of his hand. Bieni, surrounded by ravens, was already falling down. Soldiers searched the body of water by the waterfall. They had already searched every corner, but found only black charred bodies and a scrap of dark cloth, which the man silently accepted and clenched in his palm. The High Priest's reaction to the disappearance of the Great Witch was quite predictable. He was displeased with Mayklat and assumed that since no body had been found, it was highly likely that Biani was still alive. The high priest ordered the Inquisitor to find her and present her to the god this time. But Mayklat objected, and frankly admitted that he could not do it, for if he found Biani, he would not give her to anyone. The surprised high priest called him a foolish boy, but the Inquisitor parried, noting that he was doing the same thing as the high priest himself. The man gave the kneeling Inquisitor a disgruntled look and headed for the exit of the hall, dropping the news of Mayklat's removal of his powers along the way. The high priest assigned him a time of penance, during which he must fill his heart with blessing and strengthen his faith. Lastly, without even turning around, the high priest scornfully remarked that Mayklat was a heretic inquisitor. After the disappearance of the Great Witch, rumors began to spread across Karen. The strongest divine mace, Mayklat Hemlock, was enchanted by the Great Witch. After this, Mayklat took responsibility by leaving his post and began a penance to strengthen his faith in the god. The Inquisitors who replaced him continued the witch hunt, but none were able to achieve the same outstanding results as Mayklat. And at the same time, the monstrosities that everyone thought had been exterminated began to appear on the outskirts of Tempe. They moved in groups, insidiously attacking Chiron's strongholds. And Tempe began to turn into a battlefield once again, drowning in flames. A year had passed since then. Waiting outside Biani's home was Zentian, the man who had once saved her. The girl was not too friendly with him, despite all his attempts to be nice to her. Moreover, Biani would have preferred Zentian to leave altogether, considering that his wounds had already healed. The boy could only sigh. He only wanted to be friends, especially on the grounds that they owed each other their lives. Besides, surviving alone would not be easy in the near future, since the blood-crazed fanatic was back. For monsters and witches, this situation is worse than ever. And now they will rush with burning eyes to find Zentian and Biani, and since they're in the same boat, the guy wouldn't mind joining forces. Suddenly, Biani pounced on Zentian, excitedly asking if that heretic inquisitor had really returned. The boy confusedly confirmed the fact that the man had indeed returned to Tempe. Biani froze, eyes wide with astonishment. The image of Mayklat appeared in front of her eyes. There was confusion on Biani's face, and Zentian took it as a natural reaction to the news of her enemy's return. In truth, however, the girl had never forgotten the day she had last seen Mayklat, and it wasn't anger she felt. It was because of the expression on the man's face, then so worried and frightened, that the witch continued to delude herself. She believed that Mayklat's actions toward her were not sincere, and that the Inquisitor himself saw her as little more than an offering to the high priest. She had fallen into the water that day, not expecting to wake up, but she eventually opened her eyes and saw Zentian, who, judging by his black eyes, was a monster man. Besides, Biani had seen him among the monstro men at the cesspool back in Rave Fortress. As a result, she told Zentian that Mayklat Hemlock had killed her mother and she had miraculously escaped. The witch wanted to use any trick she could. The main thing was to survive and capture with her own eyes the last handful of ashes that would be left of Tempe. Presently, Zentian offered Biani to leave with him and his companions, but the girl refused. The boy was obviously sorry to lose the witch's abilities, with which they had managed to survive and exact their revenge. Biani, on the other hand, intended to clean up the house and get out of here. She advised Zentian to do the same. When asked why, the girl replied that since he was back, she should have been more careful. A raven sitting on the branches of an old tree was suddenly scorched with blue flames. As the soldier had reported to Mayklat, the crows had started circling over Tempo about a year ago, and the places where they circled most often were the places where non-believers always gathered. The Inquisitor's cheeks flared as soon as he heard that. Biani didn't even try to hide the fact that she was alive. Frustrated and angry, the man headed back to his room. As soon as he stepped inside, he could hear Biani's voice and herself, but the vision dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. Mayklat clenched his fists. This year had been unbearable for him. Not only had the man missed the Great Witch, but as soon as the truth was revealed, that the newborn had no powers, the high priest had gone into a rage. He forced Mayklat to shed his blood every day under the pretense of proving his faith. But the funny thing was, it wasn't the torture that brought torment, it was the foul odor of his own blood. Unlike that woman's blood. In the end, the high priest decided that there had been enough time to strengthen his faith and showed mercy. He ordered the whole of Tempe to be cleansed in the name of God. And for a year, there was not a day that Mayklat did not remember. This time, the man was determined not to let Biani go for anything. Biani wasn't going to fall for Mayklat's deception anymore. She had a goal to accomplish. The girl wanted to show that she could do it without him. So this time, there was no way Biani would let herself be captured. Zentian woke up to the fact that the witch, already fully dressed, was about to leave. Her hand was bleeding, hinting at the response that had occurred. The boy asked what exactly she had seen. Biani didn't lie, giving the name of Myklath and startling the monstro man with it. The Inquisitor had gotten quite close, and at this rate, he could detect them within a couple days. So the girl thanked Zentian for everything and was about to leave, but the boy made another timid attempt to keep her close. He used the witch's swollen ankle from the injury as an argument. If the girl was captured, the monstrosities would be at risk as well. Besides, if Biani could find out about Chiron's camps, then their hideout would go unnoticed. This was also why Zentian had offered to help and now crouched down, offering the girl to climb on his back. Biani hesitated, but it was the phrase that if she hesitated, she would be captured. And that's exactly what the witch didn't want to let happen. The girl decided to go together with the monsters only until they crossed the plain, and in the forest Jerlum split up. She chose this place because if they reached her there as well, it meant one thing: the fire had consumed Tempe and there'd be no point in running anymore. The witch said it so quietly that Zentian couldn't even hear it, but she didn't repeat it. They moved on their way. On the way, Biani called a squirrel to her just in case and let herself be bitten. From Zentian's look at the witch's bandaged hands, he was sorry she had to hurt herself. In a burst of emotion, the boy promised to be the first to rush into battle with Myklath. Since the Inquisitor was his worst enemy, he considered it his duty precisely to take revenge on Myklath. Biani had sensibly remarked that Zentian would die in a fight with the Inquisitor, as he was very strong. The boy took it the wrong way, thinking that Biani was worried about his life. Zentian wasn't worried about himself. As in the past, just 5 monstrosities were enough to wipe out an entire platoon of Chiron. Normal humans couldn't move as well as monstroids. Besides, they attacked at night, and Zentian personally found it amusing to see them floundering around, not knowing what to do. So the boy suggested that Biani rely on him if she was having a hard time, advised her not to take everything on herself alone. However, the witch drew the line and asked Zentian to stop saying such things. The boy visibly shrank and changed the subject, suggesting that they stop for a rest. Biani begrudgingly agreed, clearly feeling uncomfortable and even guilty in front of Zentian. At rest, the girl stared up at the night sky. The moon shone so brightly that not a single star was visible. If Chiron cleansed the entire area, he would end up subjugating the continent. The witch didn't know if that would be a salvation for the world or a downfall. Perhaps everything happening at the moment was the end that the Great Witch must predict. If the Great Witch's death could stop the end, would Biani's death prevent a catastrophe in the lands of Tempe? If that was indeed the case, then the girl was going to live until Tempe sank in flames, because she had no desire to prevent that end. Zentian returned, reporting that he had received a disturbing message from the tribesmen. It seemed they were all in danger, even though they needed to lay low for a while. The monstroids had been attacked when they were returning from their last mission, and were now in the vicinity of Irene's crossroads. And just there was the camp of the Inquisitors. The monster men were most likely the ones who were attacked by Myklath, so Zentian was going to rush to the aid of his comrades and stall for time so that Biani could get away. The girl suddenly grabbed his arm, unwilling to let go as her gut gnawed with misgivings. But the boy couldn't back down, because a year ago he was the only one who survived in that cesspool at Ray Fortress. After that, he was determined to avenge his tribesmen, and that chance he had now. Biani averted her gaze. Back then, the one who gave away the place of Zentian's tribesmen was her. With guilt, she bit her lower lip and turned away, letting the boy do as he wished. Zentian suddenly asked her to wait for him in the Hurlum forest. He had something he wanted to tell her if he managed to get back alive. Biani froze in surprise, then turned around gustily. Zentian kissed her forehead and promised to return. Myklath found the house where Biani had lived until recently. Naturally, the Inquisitors had thought it was worth looking not near the waterfall, but probably the injuries from the fall had kept the witch from traveling far. As a result, she was hiding so close. Myklath muttered that he was obviously out of his mind for not being able to smell the thick, sweet odor that filled this house. An Inquisitor nearby asked in surprise, but they were interrupted by a soldier who reported that there were at least 2 people living in the house. Myklath frowned and ordered the captured monster man to be brought in. He was dragged inside and thrown at the Inquisitor's feet. Since monstro men could sense the demonic power of their tribesmen, Myklath demanded to know if the captive could sense one of his own in this house. And that tribesman lived with the black ghost that is Biani. The frightened and tormented monster man frantically ran his eyes, but confirmed Myklath's words. His subsequent words were cut short by a soldier entering, reporting the discovery of footprints in the vicinity. Myklath grinned. The trap had slammed shut. The Inquisitor announced an urgent return to camp. They didn't need any more bait, and blue flames swirled around the monster man. Maegclat exited the burning house with the thought that he would catch Bieni before that odor dissipated. The witch collapsed at the roots of the tree, exhausted. She walked for 2 days without sleeping a wink. She managed to reach Hurlem, but something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. Bieni thought she was lucky not to run into any wild animals, but she couldn't even hear the birds singing. This didn't seem right. The witch was already doubting the need to wait for Zentian, but the face he was using to ask him to wait. Suddenly, Zentian's voice was heard calling softly to Bieni, searching for her. The witch had already exhaled in relief and wanted to call back, but her thumb was bleeding sharply. The girl realized that she needed to call out to Zentian before she fell into a response. But she didn't have time, plopping down on the ground. A squirrel sat in a cage, and across from that cage stood Mechlith, looking down at that animal. Maegclat stared intently at the beast and finally leaned closer, as if he knew that Bieni was now looking through the squirrel's eyes. The girl realized there was no time left at all. It was a short response. Maegclat knew about everything, and about the fact that the witch had allied herself with the squirrel, and about her current whereabouts, and also about her traveling with Zentian, who was still searching for her in the forest. It all turned out to be a trap, and so Bieni decided to get as far away from this place as possible, without Zentian, until Maegclat, who was following the monster man, found her. As she walked, she noticed blood oozing continuously from her finger. At this rate, the girl would be captured rather quickly, so Bieni pulled out a knife and put it to her wrist. Zentian, meanwhile, continued to wander through the forest in search of Bieni. He already guessed that the girl had left first, deciding not to wait for him. Had the lad known this before, he would have simply followed her at once, instead of splitting up. When Zentian found his companions, he saw that they were almost all in one piece. Only Ladane had been captured. They were acting strangely, also dragging their friend all together. However, Zentian decided that since the three couldn't save one, they should deal with it themselves. He was more worried about Bieni, since she was alone and not feeling well. Chelsea, and Zentian's head was so full of searching for the girl that he didn't immediately notice the surveillance. He turned to the soldiers lurking in the thicket and urged them to attack at once, to deal with it quickly. Maegclat spotted a flock of crows stained in blood. The Inquisitor grinned grimly. Bieni had decided to fill everything with the smell of blood, and judging by those desperate attempts to escape, she had indeed responded to that beast. It was unlikely that she had managed to escape the forest and was somewhere nearby. The soldier reported that the monster man had met up with his comrades, but immediately left after mentioning the companion. The mobile unit was now on his tail. Maegclat averted his gaze. Thanks to her recent response, the witch should have guessed that Maegclat was following her. If she and Zentian did team up in the current situation, it meant their relationship was close enough to take the risk. Following one report, a second followed. The mobile group was under attack, and they were engaged in battle with the monster man. Maegclat gave the order to move out there now. Zentian tried to catch his breath. He had dealt with all the pursuers, but suddenly, Maegclat himself came out to meet him. Zentian glared at him, trying to tease the Inquisitor, but the man remained cool. He pointed out that if Zentian had been smarter, he would have run instead of taking the fight, and in that case would have lasted longer, without making any transitions. The Inquisitor asked if Zentian was the same monster man that was meeting with the Black Ghost. The boy was confused. He didn't understand how the man knew that nickname, but it turned out that Zentian's comrades had laid everything out to the Inquisitor, and now Maegclat demanded to know where he and the Black Ghost had agreed to meet. Zentian muttered that the Black Ghost did not want to see an enemy of his family. Maegclat staggered, then laughed. At that moment, something let go in the Inquisitor. Zentian was the first person Bieni had met after she went on the run. But judging by this ridiculous tale of family, the witch didn't trust her companion. Zentian didn't know Bieni at all, and that pleased the Inquisitor immensely. Zentian didn't understand what Maegclat was talking about. The Inquisitor leaned toward the monster man and asked him if the Black Ghost had told him about how she had not hesitated to give away her mother's location to the Inquisition. Zentian stiffened for a few moments, but quickly came to his senses and pushed Maegclat away from him. He didn't believe him. However, the Inquisitor, having ascertained that Bieni was not particularly close to him, lost all interest in the boy. The man planned to deal with him after he found the witch, but for now, Zentian could leave. The monster man gritted his teeth angrily and rushed away. Maegclat did let him go, but at the same moment, he ordered the forest to be set ablaze and fired toward the riverbank to destroy any possible hiding places. Bieni slumped to the ground. She could no longer walk, exhausted from days without sleep and the use of response. She settled down to rest by a flowering acacia tree. Hugging her knees, the girl pondered whether she could make it to the shelter of the seashore at this rate. Bieni knew for certain that if she were captured now, she would be imprisoned for life, subjected to all sorts of experiments. The thought crept into her mind that it might be better to die here. Most of Tempe had already gone up in flames. The remaining witches would soon be finished. And, in fact, there was no reason for Bieni to cling to life so desperately anymore. But then the girl's eyes rounded. Her great witch power still hadn't disappeared, and it turns out that child couldn't inherit it. Mayklat should have noticed that by now. So he killed the child. But what if that child is still alive? Then after Bieni's death, he would possibly inherit the Great Witch's power. This left the girl shocked at first, and then she chuckled to herself with bitter irony. Bieni couldn't even die the way she wanted to. It didn't take long for the witch to fall asleep. When she woke up, the world around her was colored orange, as if it was already sunset. But soon Bieni realized that it wasn't. In fact, a fire had broken out in the forest, which made the sky flooded with red. The witch hurried to get away, but suddenly she was called by Zentian. He, worried, ran toward her with all his might. Barely reaching her, the boy grabbed Bieni by the shoulders, exhaling in relief. The witch, however, turned pale. She asked if Zentian had met Mechlith. The monster man made no effort to hide it. He hadn't killed the Inquisitor, but he had killed his subordinates. In order not to waste time, Zentian crouched down, offering Bieni to climb on his back, and the girl did not refuse. On the way, Zentian wanted to ask the witch something, but abruptly changed his mind, putting their rescue from the fire first. After a while, they came to the river. Zentian had stashed a boat, so they could cross and walk towards the lower river. But before they did, he asked if Bieni was really the great traitor witch. The girl turned away, involuntarily clenching her fists tighter. Bieni didn't answer directly, but Zentian understood everything already. Then he suddenly remembered that there, at Castle Rave, they had seen a wolf with red eyes. So the one who had discovered the monsters and reported them to the damned fanatic was his companion. Bieni continued to be speechless. She realized why Mayklat had let Zentian go. Zentian hates the Chiron who killed his tribesmen. If Zentian found out that Bieni had something to do with it, he would definitely try to kill her. That was why she kept telling him to stay away from her. She didn't think she deserved his kindness. The witch coldly clarified, if that was all Zentian was going to tell her. She called it odd that a man ready to sink his teeth into a heretic would suddenly tell her about her and then still let the monster man go. But Bieni didn't think it wise to continue this conversation. Now, as it would drag on for a long time and they were being chased after all. She desperately tried to change the topic and get away from this conversation, at least for a while. However, an agitated Zentian grabbed her arm. He himself realized that Mayklat was deliberately sowing discord between them. But if Bieni said it wasn't her after all, Zentian was willing to believe it. The witch half turned at him and uttered one simple truth. Zentian didn't trust her anymore, so there was no point in making excuses. The monster man tried to deny it, but finally agreed to cross the river first, and having already reached a safe place to talk quietly. With these words, Zentian went to get the boat. Bieni, under the pretext of looking for animals, headed in the opposite direction, mentally apologizing to her boyfriend. Witches' sanctuaries were scattered everywhere to shelter them from being hunted or from natural disasters. This neighborhood was nothing but underground ruins. The witches probably thought that Bieni had reported this place too, but at least the girl hadn't reported it to anyone. Finding the right ledge, the witch pushed back the cover and squeezed into the narrow passage. Suddenly her attention was drawn to the strange sounds outside. There was a desperate cry from Zentian telling the witch to run. Bieni realized it was Mayklat and clamped her hands over her mouth to keep from giving herself away, her body trembling. She stepped back cautiously, but suddenly a branch crunched beneath her heel. Bieni hurried inside, but on the way she cut the skin of her forearm on a sharp ledge of the wall. Barely out of the passage, Bieni ran inside, then turned around. There should be no gap visible from the outside. Suddenly, Bieni was reached by the voice of Mechleth, and then a soldier reporting the monster man's whereabouts. The Inquisitor ordered him to be captured. The witch, who was worried about Zentian, stepped forward in a burst of emotion. Mayklat stared into the crevice in the rock, knowing for sure that Bieni was hiding there. Mayklat knew for certain that Bieni was standing on the other side, watching him through the gap. He thought hard about what exactly he should say on their next meeting, for they had spent too little time together to talk of longing. The Inquisitor supposed that the witch regretted the failure of her attempt to die. After all, if she had died then, she would have been able to escape from Mayklat forever. Zentian, who had been captured, cried out desperately, begging for Biene to escape as soon as possible, but Meklet thought it was too late to escape from him. The girl had already betrayed the witch, and now she had betrayed the monster men as well. She had no one else to rely on in this land, and Meklet himself was the only one who could make Biene's wishes come true. The girl knew that. But she also knew who could destroy those wishes. She asked Meklet with a wicked determination not to worry because now she definitely didn't trust anyone. After these words, Biene resolutely turned around and headed deep into the shelter, biting her lips painfully. The girl kept walking and walking, not stopping and not paying attention to the swollen ankle. In her haste, she tripped and fell. Angry tears came to her eyes. But suddenly voices were heard ahead, and the warm light of the fire poured from the cave. Biene came out to the fire where the witches were sitting. They were confused for a few seconds, but then happiness lit up their faces. The women began to stretch their hands toward her, happy that the great witch had finally returned to them. Biene shivered at the nearest hands. She didn't understand why she was being welcomed even though she had committed treachery. However, the witches believed that the girl could redeem herself if she did her duty. They forgave her and rushed to embrace her. Tears flowed down Biene's cheeks despite the sudden joy of her tribeswomen. This warm welcome meant she had returned to the worst time in her life. The witches drove away down the mountain path in a wagon. Biene sat hugging her knees. The witches had just taken her with them. On the other hand, even if they knew about everything, it didn't change anything. Oh, and with a damaged ankle, Biene wouldn't be able to escape. Involuntarily, she thought of the words of Meklet that he had said to her recently. If the man had said the same thing now, Biene might have grabbed his outstretched hand, because when he said it, Meklet's voice sounded as if the girl longed for him, as much as she longed for the Inquisitor's selfless kindness, which she would never forget. On the other hand, it was funny. Biene missed a man who would mercilessly sacrifice her to God, a sword-worthy high priest and inquisitor with unwavering faith in God. There was no way he would abandon God to fulfill Biene's cherished wish. Zentian knelt in front of Meklet. The inquisitor yanked the boy toward him, demanding to know exactly where Biene was headed. Zentian wasn't going to reveal that even under pain of death, and Meklet grimaced angrily. He realized that the monster man simply didn't know where exactly the witch had gone. With a single swing, Meklet scaled the rock, widening the entrance. The Inquisitor went after the Great Witch personally and ordered the soldiers to deal with Zentian and follow Meklet. The man needed to hurry before the smell of Biene's blood dissipated. Meklet moved swiftly down the underground passageway. It had been a year since they had last met, and if only there hadn't been a stone wall between them, the Inquisitor would have immediately reached out his arms and embraced Biene. He had forgotten everything but this woman. These thoughts gave off such bitterness that Meklet slammed his fist into the wall. Looking at Biene, he realized his attraction, which could not be denied. Earlier, the High Priest had personally sent him back to Tempe again, because of the suspicious activity of the Monstro men. However, one look was enough for the High Priest to realize who the Inquisitor was thinking of. This overwhelming lust the man took as proof of the Great Witch's power. So the High Priest suddenly allowed Meklet to do as he saw fit. But in return, the Inquisitor had to force Biene to give birth to an heiress. When that happened, the girl would lose her powers and Meklet would present her offspring to God. The Plat didn't understand why go to such extremes. The answer was simple, just in case. If God suddenly announced that he was taking away the blessing bestowed upon the land, would Meklet be able to adjust? If all the judges who acted according to God's will disappeared, a vast amount of evil would spread through the land, and the High Priest, according to him, is merely trying to prevent the destruction of the land. It was agonizing for Meklet to think of this errand. If demanding such a thing from a woman who begged to cleanse the land of her hateful blood, she might as well try to kill herself this time. The man definitely wouldn't be able to stand it if he saw Biene like this again. He would not let her die. The witches stopped. They informed Biene that her mother had given birth to a younger sister, but the child was taken away by Chiron. However, until now, the Great Witch's offspring who did not have powers died as soon as they were born. At that time, it wasn't clear how that child survived, since Biene was still a Great Witch. The thing was that children originally didn't possess any power. This meant that Biene had found the beast that would bring destruction. The Great Witch's powers only existed to find it. And since Biene had found it, its power no longer worked. This conclusion delighted the witches. They rejoiced at the success of their Great Witch, and now they demanded to fulfill the destiny. Biene realized that those words in the cave about duty meant just that. The Great Witch had made a connection with the beast that would cause the end of the world, and now the women were going to kill her to stop the destruction of the earth. Bieni stared at the water, absent-mindedly pondering. She couldn't believe that it seemed it was really time to say goodbye. Bieni stared at the water. The day the witch had jumped off the cliff, she had told Maiklat about her dream of dying in the water. Indeed, Bieni had always wanted to drown. More specifically, to drown in the sea, to give all of herself to the water and dissolve without a trace. Bieni looked at the crows circling overhead. The witch next to her said that just drowning wasn't enough. There was a sword buried somewhere out there that needed to be found. Bieni retorted by asking what exactly the witches would do if even Bieni's death could not avert the coming of the end. She was the only great witch, and if she died and nothing changed, the witches would be finished. Would that be the end? The witch, however, was not worried. If Bieni died, the new great witch would take over the mission. The girl froze in surprise. If this witch says so, then she is not the last blood relative, and the younger sister is still alive after all. This scarred woman colluded with Chiron and didn't even try to deny it. In the end, Bieni was unable to save this child. The witch, meanwhile, explained that they were ordinary people who couldn't even conjure. Everyone was surviving as best they could. Therefore, it didn't matter to them whether Bieni would die and thus stop the end of the world, or whether the new great witch would inherit the power. This drove Bieni to despair. There was no point in her resistance and actions in such a case. She staggered back, not realizing what she had been fighting for and surviving and running away all this time. The witch grabbed her by the arm and dragged her behind her to fulfill her duty as a great witch and stop the end. Just after a while, the preparations were finished, and a shrunken beignet was led to the right place. The burning, frightened faces of the other witches were turned on her. One of them took out a knife and brought it above her head, but was never able to bring it down. The woman was scorched by blue flames. Before Bieni knew it, she was embraced from behind by Maiklat. The first thing she said to him was an expression of regret that she wasn't dead after all. Then in response, Maiklat reminded her that for her sake, he was willing to destroy everything and sink in fire. All he asked in return from Bieni was to give himself. And if God had given up the girl's body, then Maiklat was going to take her with him and keep her in his sight at all times, even if Bieni's embrace would relegate him to hell after death. The witch looked at him with a frozen stare, and then cried openly. Bieni woke up in a chamber. The girl recognized this room, which was within the confines of the Rave Fortress. The witch got out of bed, but Maiklat, who noticed this, suddenly lifted her in his arms and laid her back down. The girl tried to convince him that everything was fine, but the Inquisitor clearly didn't think so. He informed her that now Bieni would have to eat only soup with no seasoning. The wounds would be treated every day twice. In the morning and evening, in the presence of Maiklat himself, the witch clarified whether the man who had been responsible for this last time would be in charge, which clearly threw the Inquisitor off balance. However, the Inquisitor only remarked that he had found a new attending physician. Bieni pressed her lips together, pulling the blanket against her chest. She wondered if she would now be handed over to the high priest or have her blood taken for experiments. In short, the girl knowingly did not hope for positive outcomes. But Maiklat pushed the girl onto the bed and hovered over her. The Inquisitor reminded Bieni that even if he cleansed these lands of all evil, she alone would survive, and her place was next to Maiklat. With those words, the man kissed the witch, but allowed himself nothing more. He only advised Bieni to sleep some more and left. The girl gave him a glance and touched her own lips with her fingertips. On them, she noticed blood. It had been reported to Maiklat that the monstroids had most likely decided to lay low. Likewise, it wasn't easy to find even one witch. Dacian said Maiklat shook the goblet the witches used during the ritual thoughtfully. As soon as he had seen Bieni in this state, he had burned it to the ground. But now, assessing the situation soberly, the Inquisitor should have kept at least one witch alive. The sword was fine, but what about the goblet? The matter was complicated by the fact that there was no one to interrogate. Maiklat ordered the soldiers to clean up, giving them time to concentrate on resting. A soldier hesitated and stammered about Priest Brown, but was cut short. Maiklat clearly didn't like the fact that there were still priests in the fortress. The soldier immediately promised to send the priest away. The Inquisitor, on the other hand, let them go. He headed for the chambers as Bieni could not be left for a second. The man was afraid that strange thoughts would arise in her mind again. The new attending physician, Moria, was just coming out of the room. She didn't quite understand how Bieni had managed to last until today, considering that there was no living space left on her body. Her right ankle was particularly damaged. The doctor couldn't guarantee its recovery. The ankle might have to be chopped off altogether. The woman advised not to let Bieni move until she was well enough. Maiklat told the doctor that Bieni should be made healthy. But his thoughts were at odds with his words. He thought that if the girl was really left without an ankle, she would not be able to run anywhere else. When Myclat entered the room, Bieni was sitting on the floor. A tray of food stood in front of her. A man frowned confusedly. The girl had been served the food in bed, but the witch, afraid of spilling it on the bed, settled on the floor. However, displeased with this, the Inquisitor told her to eat right in bed next time, so she wouldn't have to move. Besides, he didn't like the fact that Bieni didn't eat everything that was brought. Medication didn't work on an empty stomach, after all. In addition, Myclat wondered why the witch hadn't eaten on the sofa then. If she was afraid to eat in bed, the girl carelessly objected that the sofa belonged to the Inquisitor, and the man interpreted it as a sign of dislike, as if she was unwilling to sit there simply because that was where Myclat sat. Bieni was embarrassed and hastened to object. It wasn't about dislike. On top of everything else, the witch didn't understand why Myclat still hadn't killed her, even though he should have. The Inquisitor was taken aback. He sat down beside Bieni and picked up the tray. He asked why the girl had come to that conclusion. The witch nervously crumpled her dress and looked away. Only with her death would the power of the Great Witch be passed on. The Inquisitor still hadn't killed the descendant of the Great Witch captured a year ago, so they still needed her because she could inherit the power. Myclat brought his eyebrows down to the bridge of his nose in thoughtfulness. After the day he had handed over the child, the man had heard nothing more about the child. A child who had not inherited the power. Needless to say, the Inquisitor also assumed the girl would be killed. So what Bieni had said was a revelation to the man. But then why did the High Priest say to present the offspring born to Bieni to God? Did the High Priest keep that child because of the Great Witch's blood, which could come in handy someday? Myclat was so thoughtful that he didn't even immediately notice how intently and frowningly Bieni was looking at him. He touched her cheek and said that if anyone was to die, it would not be Bieni, but the child. Myclat kissed the girl, who barely pushed him away from her in an effort to catch her breath. The Inquisitor thought the reason for Bieni's panting was that she had eaten very little. The witch indignantly remarked that when she was brought to the fortress for the first time, there were not enough provisions even for the soldiers, and it was a shame to transfer the food to the witch, so the Inquisitor was the one who ordered that she be fed so that only she would not die. Since then, the amount of food that Bieni could eat had not changed. Myclat, in an attempt to justify himself, remarked that he was the one who had ordered an increase in the amount of food afterward, and Bieni recalled that the man had told her not to clutter his eyes with her unsightly appearance. The Inquisitor turned away in embarrassment at this and then in a softer tone said to eat more from now on, for one extra mouthful would certainly not make the fortress poorer. After another kiss, Myclat hugged Bieni, asking her to get better soon. When the doctor examined Bieni's leg once again, she noticed that the swelling had finally gone down. It was too early to remove the splint, but the girl could already walk on a crutch. The witch thanked the woman for the treatment, but she dismissed it as her job. Then Bieni asked her if she knew that the girl was a great witch. The doctor replied that there was no one in the castle who did not know of her identity, and everyone understood what would happen if they touched Bieni. Therefore, the girl could not be ceremonious with anyone, even the doctor. Except for one person, the master of the fortress, who at this time was watching them standing nearby. And when the doctor reported the end of the treatment for the day, the Inquisitor noticed the slowness of the recovery. The doctor could only recommend that Bieni be brought out into the sunlight once a day, if only for half an hour. Short walks wouldn't hurt either. When asked if the woman would take over in case something happened, she did not agree, because there was no reason to do so. Living in confinement in such a small room would make any even healthy person sickly. Myclat rubbed his eyes tiredly. Bieni said that she might not go out, because if she went out, the Inquisitor would think that the girl was trying to bewitch the soldiers. The girl didn't want to cause trouble. Myclat covered his eyes. It turned out that he had said such things to Bieni too. How many stupid things they had said. Bieni suddenly suggested that all this treatment Myclat arranged only to have someone to warm the bed. But the man abruptly cut her off. If that were really the case, he would have possessed the witch on the first day. But if he wasn't going to hand her over to the High Priest, and he wasn't holding out for someone to please him, in bed. For the first time, Myclat had spared Bieni for denouncing him, and the girl didn't know what the Inquisitor wanted from her now. The man averted his gaze, trying to find the words. He told the witch about how he simply could not kill Bieni. Myclat couldn't kill her, even if it was to purify her in the name of the Lord God. So he asked her to stop wondering about the reason for his kindness, just pretend as if she didn't know anything, and try to get used to her current life, get so used to it that she would no longer want to ask why. Then Mayaklat left, saying that he would come after Bieni after lunch for a light walk. Left alone, Bieni clenched her dress in her fists. She was afraid of getting used to the man's kindness and did not know because of this what she should do now. Mayaklat, as promised, led the witch outside. They had only walked a short distance, but Bieni was already a little tired. So Mayaklat suggested she sit down and rest, which she did. While they were sitting, a squirrel ran up to the witch's feet, and the girl, out of old habit, reached for it. But the Inquisitor, taking it hostilely, intercepted the witch's hand and yanked it toward him. The unfortunate beast burned in a blue flame. Mayaklat assumed that Bieni was trying to take advantage of the response to be able to escape in the future. The witch had to explain that it was just an old habit. After all, smaller beasts needed less blood, and she was more at ease when she kept an eye on her surroundings. Obviously, Bieni wasn't planning an escape. Mayaklat, hearing this, immediately let go of the girl's hand and rested his forehead on his interlocked hands. He really didn't understand why, if not to escape, because Bieni felt the pain of both the bite and the response. But the witch had lived with the sensation of pain all her life and simply didn't pay much attention to it anymore. Then Mayaklat promised to prevent any more wounds from appearing on her body in all the time that Bieni would be given. The witch wanted to reply something, but shied away and turned away, once again changing the subject and saying that with her leg, escape was impossible. Mayaklat suddenly knelt down in front of her and looked at the girl's ankle. He told her of the doctor's words to her about how if her leg strained just a little more, it would have to be cut off. The Inquisitor himself had contemplated breaking Bieni's limbs on purpose. Then she definitely wouldn't run away from him. But, after all, he was the most courteous man in her life. Bieni stared at Mayaklat with all her eyes, and when he gave her his hand to walk a little further, she accepted it. And, holding hands, they walked on down the avenue. And Bieni pushed Mayaklat away from her. She tried to remind him that she shouldn't overexert herself, but the Inquisitor parried it by saying that the splint from her leg had already been removed and the girl could bear such loads. But the doctor by exertion hardly meant that. Having finished speaking, Bieni froze, staring at the man's torso. Mayaklat grinned wickedly and asked, as if casually, if she had seen enough. This embarrassed the witch. While she hesitated, the man pulled her to him again. Suddenly, Bieni shoved Mayaklat, and the Inquisitor, who had not expected such a thing, found himself pinned to the bed with his shoulder blades. The girl sitting on top of him became worried and began to explain that she hadn't done it on purpose. Mayaklat stared at the witch's face with a surprised look, then slanted his gaze lower, and laughed, confusing Bieni completely. Mayaklat's words that the strain the doctor was talking about was nothing compared to this one didn't bode well. Gestizen forsated the pans of the morning. Bieni felt wrecked. Her back was aching, and the girl was thinking of taking a walk. She looked out of the room and expressed her desire for a walk to the soldier guarding the entrance. The man asked to be given some time to get ready. And so a fully dressed Bieni walked with a convoy of soldiers walking behind her. Since the witch and the Inquisitor had started sharing the same bed, Mayaklat had stopped padlocking the room. This meant that Bieni was allowed to roam freely around the fortress, though granted she was followed by soldiers every time. After all, she was still the Great Witch. She strolled through the garden. She once again saw no hint of squirrels or any other animals. They had been gone since that day. Though Bieni hadn't thought to deliberately make a connection with animals to provoke him in any case. In turn, it was generous of him to let the witch walk wherever she wanted. No one had ever treated her with such kindness before. At the thought of Bieni's kindness, Zenton came to mind. It's likely that Mayaklat killed him, since he's a monster man. But even if he is alive, Bieni probably didn't want to meet him in person, as she just couldn't imagine looking him in the eyes. He knew now that the girl had deceived him. He just wanted to make sure that Zentian was still alive. Crows flew over Bieni's head with the wind. A soldier quickly approached the girl, as the witch should have returned to the room. But she did not have time to leave. She was suddenly called by Pepin Toth. The soldiers, without thinking long, shoved Bieni away from him. Pepin tried to approach the witch after all, calling himself her attending doctor, but the girl interrupted him. Dr. Moria was now her physician, and the soldiers led Bieni away to the fortress, leaving the man with nothing. Pepin muttered that they would see each other again soon anyway. There was a gloomy atmosphere between Pepin and Mayaklat talking in the study. The doctor remarked that it was rude of the Inquisitor to drive all the priests away, but not only did not Mayaklat repent for this, but he added that he had also thrown out all the doctors on top of everything else. Pepin made no reply to this. He had come to the fortress on the orders of the high priest, who had been very worried about Mayaklat lately. The man looked at the doctor carefully, and a hunch struck him. Papin was the one who had stolen the Great Witch's descendant. To this, Papin countered that he had been given the go-ahead to conduct experiments. Besides, without the Great Witch, they were forced to find a replacement for her. Although at this moment, there was no need for a replacement since the Great Witch had shown up in person. Barely hearing that statement, Mayklat slammed his fist down on the table. He wasn't going to let the doctor anywhere near Bieni, and instead of idle chatter about it, the Inquisitor demanded to know the reason why the High Priest's confidant had come here. Papin made no objection to the master of the fortress. What they were interested in was that monster man boy, Zentian. Mayklat had kept him alive only to find out what Bieni had eaten and what kind of environment he had lived in the previous year. The doctor said that knowing such details would help in improving the effectiveness of the treatment. Papin was going to meet this monster man. According to him, it was not about the doctor's personal interests, but about the High Priest's deteriorating health. The Inquisitor approved the meeting, but with the condition that an escort in the form of guards be attached. Papin, however, flatly refused this condition, since everything concerning the High Priest's health was kept in the strictest secrecy. Mayklat gritted his teeth. Papin had given a time limit of 10 days, and in that time something shouldn't have happened by locking Bieni in a room. In the end, the Inquisitor agreed. Papin brightened up but immediately turned down when he heard that he would be assigned a room not far from the underground prison. He suddenly began to exhort Mayklat, saying that he must not forget the will of God by succumbing to the Great Witch's charms, and that even if the devil had obscured his eyes with beauty, he must not lose his mind at his sweet talk. These words clearly did not belong to the doctor. Papin cried out that the High Priest had a great burden to keep the people from losing the God-given blessing. But Mayklat ordered him away, and the soldiers, disregarding the shouts and outrages, dragged the doctor out of the door. The Inquisitor, on the other hand, was deep in thought. The High Priest himself had spoken of the possibility of losing God's blessing. But what was this God's blessing? The Inquisitor should have studied this question. Bieni took a long look at the peaceful sleeping face of Mayklat beside her. She couldn't believe that every day was now filled with tranquility, and she didn't know if she could enjoy it. Barely thinking about it, the witch pulled herself back, trying to leave these strange thoughts behind. Mayklat woke up. It was already time for him to get up. He was off to pray again, for just as Bieni had a duty as a great witch, so did Mayklat's duty to serve God. Bieni had no idea what a man determined to go to hell with the Great Witch could pray for. The Inquisitor, on the other hand, revealed that Dr. Papin would be staying at the castle for a couple of days on the High Priest's orders. Mayklat asked the girl to bear this unpleasantness for only 10 days and to speak if she needed anything, and if she didn't need anything, she could make it up. Mayklat was willing to give her anything she wanted. Bieni, however, only smiled and replied that she had enough of everything. The soldier, stammering to a disgruntled Mayklat, reported that they had been negligent as there had been no action from the monstroids. As a result, they had gotten too close, and it was necessary to quell their rebellion as soon as possible. The Inquisitor exhaled tiredly. On top of these problems, the scum Papin had also requested more time to visit the captured monster man. In annoyance, Mayklat told the soldier to warn Papin to shut up if he didn't want to stay in the underground prison forever. But, as the soldier pointed out, the doctor had a high priest symbol that made no one dare treat him carelessly. Mayklat rubbed his eyelids and asked to continue. It appeared that Zentian had asked to meet the Great Witch, for that was the only way he would cooperate with the doctor, even if the monster man just saw her. Mayklat's face took on a fearful expression, so the soldier even began to stammer, but he continued. Papin also suggested that if the monstro man cooperated with him, his stay here would be cut in half. Mayklat thought about Bieni. She would definitely be homesick to be cooped up for 10 whole days, and the Inquisitor had agreed to honor Papin's feisty request one last time. The man suggested that nothing would happen if Bieni and the monster man would just see each other. Mayklat led Bieni under his arm to meet Zentian. The girl never would have thought that they would meet under such circumstances. She didn't yet know the reasons why the Inquisitor had allowed them to see each other. They entered the dungeon, where they were met by Papin and an exhausted Zentian sat behind the bars. Mayklat had no intention of staying with Bieni here for long. Moreover, he wanted to leave almost immediately, but the girl suddenly asked permission to speak to the monster man alone to say goodbye in peace. The Inquisitor hesitated, but in the end, he did not obstruct. He only threatened Zentian with retaliation if he tried anything weird. After that, he and Papin left the cell. The first thing Zentian said was his observation about the girl's appearance. She looked healthy. The guy confessed that he thought it was all a lot of nonsense, but it turned out that Bieni was really in league with this fanatic. The witch couldn't take it anymore and rushed to the bars, asking why Zentian hadn't contacted his comrades even though he could have. He had, but he didn't explain why he was still behind bars. He considered it more important to warn Bieni now. The Inquisitor, as it turned out, wanted a child from Bieni. The witch froze like that with her eyes wide open, and Zentian continued to slash at the living. Bieni's child would be a descendant of the Great Witch. They are targeting the child who will inherit this power since the stolen child is dead, and they need a new one. And the Inquisitor wants Bieni to give birth. What's more, Papin said that the baby won't come at once, and this madman hopes that someday it will be his turn. Bieni slid to the stone floor with shock. Zentian, on the other hand, told her that his comrades would soon foment a mutiny outside, after which Mayaclath would leave the fortress. The boy was going to pretend that he was willing to cooperate with the doctor, and would insist that his collar be removed. He planned to wait for the opportune moment and escape. However, Bieni had already failed to hear most of what he was saying. Her whole gut was gripped by the shock of what she had heard. Her world, when she had just begun to hope for the best, had crumbled again. Zentian continued to beg her to leave with him. Meanwhile, Mayclath flew into the dungeon, immediately crouching next to Bieni and asking the monster man in a menacing voice what he had said to her. Zentian lowered his head so that he couldn't see the tears rolling down his face, and answered the question with a question. Mole, what exactly could he say to a traitorous woman who had run off alone to selfishly save her own skin? Mayclath clawed at the bar of the bars with murderous intent, but Papin appealed to the voice of reason. The captive could not be killed. Mayclath barely suppressed his anger and reached out a hand to help Bieni to her feet. She held out her hand in return, but her palm trembled. Bieni deduced that Mayclath went away every day to pray because the mace of God had to hold the foul witch in his arms. The Inquisitor, seeing her condition, simply lifted the girl in his arms and carried her to the exit. And in this man's arms, Bieni realized all this from the beginning was only for God's cause. But even now, his embrace seemed gentle to the witch. Bieni in Mayclath's arms suddenly started crying. The man tried to find out the reason and incessantly said that if the girl was suddenly in pain, she should definitely tell him. The witch waved it off, said it was fine, and let it continue. Suddenly, Bieni asked why Karen no longer desired the Great Witch's power. She desperately pleaded for an answer, but Mayclath couldn't tell her the truth. He warned that he was marching tomorrow against the monster men who had gotten too close. And most likely, when Bieni opened her eyes, she would already be in the room alone. He promised to return quickly, and the girl asked him to be more careful. Her heart was breaking. That was Mayclath's answer before setting out on his trek. Mayclath cast a fleeting glance at the darkening windows, behind one of which Bieni might be standing. Clutching the reins tighter, the Inquisitor loudly ordered to increase the pace of the suppression and consign every creature without a trace to the flames. Bieni glanced out the window, then turned around at the sounds of fighting. Zentian was tearing the guards apart mercilessly, but when he saw the witch coming out to him, he calmed down. He held out his hand to her, but at the last moment they were overtaken by the doctor's shout. The woman excitedly warned the Great Witch that if she ran away now, Mayclath might actually kill her. Bieni asked her to stay back and tell the Inquisitor that the Great Witch's blood would break on her, so let her ignore this useless power and pretend as if it didn't exist at all. The woman made another unsuccessful call to Bieni, who was walking away, but was distracted by the window where the crows were circling. As she and Zentian walked away, the witch thought bitterly that she should have died much earlier when she knew nothing. She should have just died then, falling off the cliff, when she had no idea. Mayclath returned well after everything had happened. The fortress greeted him with an empty room that no longer contained Bieni. Moria had relayed the words that her lineage would not continue. When the Inquisitor entered the dungeon where the monster man was being held, he found only the corpse of Papin. From the breathless body, the man took a scroll that contained the phrases, "The origins of the High Priest's divine power stem from, in order not to lose divine power, he must, the power of the Monstro Men and the Great Witch, and by necessity, impregnate the Great Witch." In an angry outburst, Mayclath hurled the scroll directly at the doctor's blood and swiftly left the dungeon. As the Inquisitor stepped out into the courtyard and jumped into his saddle, Moria tried to stop him, but he never reacted. In the forest, Zentian once again carried Bieni on his back, though she could already walk on her own, and the girl had told him so. But the monster man stubbornly carried her forward, eager to reach the meeting point with his comrades. At some point, however, Zentian collapsed to the ground without strength. When Bieni sat down on the ground, she looked at the monstro men who were clearly unfriendly to her. However, the witch had only asked them to escort her to the shore. Neither they nor she wanted to be captured again. And in this, they all agreed with Biani. One of the monster men volunteered to give the witch a ride. On the way, they stopped for a rest as it was still a long ride to their destination. At the campfire, Biani's companion asked the girl how it was that a crazy fanatic had picked on her. But in the desire of Karen to get the power of the Great Witch, Monster Man did not see a good reason. The power is needed by the High Priest, and the fanatic had no particular reason to keep Biani to himself. It was the High Priest who took away the power of the Monstro Men. He had become a vessel, so unless they obeyed him, their magic power would gradually start to weaken. This man was completely different from a decrepit old man, just because of the power of the Monstroids, but now he was apparently targeting the Great Witch's power. Biani stared thoughtfully at the fire. The girl, on the other hand, told me that she puts poison on her blades, and this poison was so toxic that even a light touch could kill. However, the Monster Man thought that she could protect them without poison. She clearly didn't mind talking some more, but Biani, apologizing, was the first to drift off to sleep. But before she fell asleep, she heard her companion say that Mayklat had detected the Great Witch a year ago, but had not given her away. Apparently, Biani had taken a liking to him. But it didn't matter now. At last, they reached the right place, to the Great Witch's final resting place. Biani thanked the girl for her help. The latter asked if the witch wanted to leave any will, which the Monster Man was ready to fulfill. When asked if Biani had any will, the girl asked that Zentian be given her thanks and apologies. Monster Human sighed, noting that first love always comes with a lump, and Zentian was no exception. Biani began to step into the water. She was restrained by the cold and heaviness, but it was bearable for now. If she had known it would turn out so easily, she would have turned to the Monstroids from the start. Now the girl regretted the effort she had spent on Mayklat, for all she had gotten was a broken heart. Biani suddenly stopped. The Monster Man from the shore asked her what was wrong, but the witch didn't answer. It was cold and viscous. The seaweed was getting more and more entangled in her thin legs, and Biani couldn't move a step. Monster Man concluded that the witch was simply afraid of death. Since that was the case, she decided to help her and drew her sword from its sheath, promising her a painless death. Biani stared into the water, thinking herself a fool for falling for the calm so easily. The witch had already taken it as a good thing that someone would help her in this endeavor, or else she would still change her mind about dying. Slash was heard behind her. The Monstro Man immediately realized who had come after them. The Great Witch had taken a liking to the fanatic. Mechlith stood on the shore with a naked blade. The Inquisitor remembered that Biani had wanted to die in the water, so he had gotten there quickly, for this was the closest shore to the fortress. Mayklat entered the water and asked the witch not to move. The Monstro Man immediately became enraged at how she was being blatantly neglected and ignored. She attacked first, but the Inquisitor parried the blow. It was difficult for Mayklat to fight, for he was afraid of accidentally catching Biani. Nevertheless, when his opponent came ashore, the man stabbed her with his sword in a couple of blows and half-turned to Biani. He remarked aloofly that he was willing to destroy anything for the witch's sake, but it wasn't enough. In reality, though, Mayklat could not destroy the one thing that Biani desired, couldn't kill her. The witch was caught up in this. She screamed, not understanding why they even needed the Great Witch's power when he already had divine power. Biani asked to be treated simply as a servant of the devil, but Mechlith unexpectedly shocked the girl by telling her that he was actually trying to save her. Not the Great Witch, but Biani. The girl, hearing this, bowed her head harder, covering her face with her hair. She asked not to lie to her or hide her interest in the Great Witch's power. After all, Biani couldn't get rid of her doubts, and therefore couldn't believe either. She just wouldn't be able to get used to gratuitous kindness. Mayklat pressed his lips together and suddenly, arching his eyebrows in misery, asked her earnestly and wistfully what exactly he should do to kindle in Biani the desire to live. This suddenly cheered the girl. She smiled and told him that no such method existed. While Mayklat was distracted, the wounded but alive monster Shilovek threw a dagger that plunged into Biani's body. So, we look forward to your comments about this story. To not miss new videos, please subscribe to notifications. Thanks for watching.